Chapter 1, Arrival at Temptations Resorts. Cruz Bailey reclined in the plush leather seat of his private jet, the faint hum of the engines barely audible over the soft murmur of conversation. Beside him sat Victoria, her long legs crossed elegantly as she scrolled through her tablet, the diamond bracelet on her wrist catching the sunlight. She exuded sophistication, her every movement precise and deliberate, as though the world were always watching. Cruz couldn't help but admire her beauty, though lately, something felt off between them. Their conversations had grown polite, their passion subdued, as if the marriage they once cherished had been relegated to routine. "We'll be landing soon," he said, adjusting his watch. "I think you'll love this place. It's supposed to be one of the most exclusive resorts in the Caribbean." Victoria gave him a polite smile but said nothing. She looked out the window, her expression unreadable. Cruz sighed inwardly. This trip was supposed to rekindle the spark they'd lost, but her silence already felt like a bad omen. Across the aisle, Jake leaned back in his seat, stretching his arms with a casual grin. "This is just what we need," he said, glancing at Cruz. "A week in paradise, no emails, no phone calls, just sun, sea, and good company." His wife, Susan, sat beside him, flipping through a travel magazine. She was the polar opposite of Victoria, bright, bubbly, and effortlessly charming. She looked up and flashed Cruz a smile that felt warmer than the tropical sun waiting for them. "Don't forget the cocktails," she teased, nudging Jake playfully. "I plan to try every one on the menu." Jake laughed, leaning over to kiss her cheek. "You're lucky I married someone with such lofty goals." Cruz chuckled, but he couldn't help but notice the ease with which Jake and Susan interacted. There was a lightness between them, an intimacy that he and Victoria seemed to have misplaced somewhere along the way. The jet landed smoothly on the island's private airstrip, and the couples disembarked into the balmy Caribbean breeze. Waiting for them was a sleek black limousine, its driver holding a sign that read Temptations Resorts, VIP guests. The ride to the resort was a spectacle in itself. The limousine wound its way through lush tropical landscapes, the scent of hibiscus and salt water filling the air. Susan pressed her nose to the window, marveling at the vibrant greenery and turquoise waters. "This is like something out of a movie," she said, her voice tinged with awe. Jake draped an arm over her shoulder. "I told you this would be worth taking a week off." Cruz exchanged a glance with Victoria, hoping for some shared excitement, but she merely offered a faint smile and turned back to her phone. When the limousine pulled up to the entrance of Temptations Resorts, the sight was breathtaking. The main building stood like a palace against the backdrop of the ocean, its sleek architecture blending modern luxury with tropical charm. Staff dressed in crisp white uniforms greeted them with chilled towels and glasses of champagne. "Welcome to Temptations Resorts," said a strikingly handsome concierge with a warm smile. "You've booked the Emerald Villas, our most exclusive accommodation. Allow me to show you to your private suites." The couples were whisked away in a golf cart to their villa, a stunning retreat perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The villa featured 2 separate wings, each with its own infinity pool, while a shared living area opened onto a sprawling terrace. Cruz whistled appreciatively as they stepped inside. "Now this," he said, "is what I call a vacation." Victoria nodded, walking over to the glass wall that framed the view. "It's beautiful," she said softly, her voice almost wistful. Susan wandered into the kitchen, running her hands along the marble countertops. "I don't think I'll ever want to leave," she declared. Jake grinned, clapping Cruz on the back. "You sure know how to pick 'em, buddy. This is incredible." Cruz shrugged modestly, though he couldn't deny he enjoyed the praise. "Only the best for my friends." After settling into their respective wings, the couples reconvened on the terrace for drinks. A butler appeared with a tray of mojitos, the mint leaves glistening like jewels in the sunlight. The 4 of them raised their glasses, toasting to a week of relaxation and adventure. "To good friends and even better memories," Cruz said, his voice carrying a rare note of optimism. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the group's laughter filled the air. For the first time in a long time, Cruz felt a sense of contentment. He leaned back in his chair, watching Susan animatedly recount a story about Jake's misadventures on a previous vacation. Her energy was infectious, and he found himself smiling more than he had in weeks. Victoria, meanwhile, seemed to come alive as the evening wore on. She and Jake had drifted into a deep conversation about art, their shared passion bridging the gap that had grown between her and Cruz. From across the table, Cruz noticed how her laughter sounded freer, more genuine, when she was talking to Jake. As the evening turned to night, a warm breeze carried the scent of frangipani through the air. Susan rose from her seat, stretching her arms above her head. "I think I'm going to call it a night," she said, stifling a yawn. "This paradise has me completely drained." Jake stood as well, placing a hand on her back. "We'll see you two in the morning." "Thanks for an amazing start to the trip, Cruz." Cruz nodded, watching as the couple disappeared into their wing of the villa. He turned to Victoria, who was still gazing at the ocean. "Ready to head in?" he asked gently. She hesitated before nodding. "Yes. It's been a long day." They walked back to their suite in silence, the warmth of the evening doing little to thaw the chill that seemed to have settled between them. Cruz tried to shake off the unease, telling himself that there was plenty of time to reconnect. This was only the first night, after all. As Victoria disappeared into the bathroom, Cruz stepped out onto their private balcony, staring out at the endless expanse of dark water. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was soothing, yet his mind buzzed with restless energy. This was supposed to be a chance to rekindle their marriage, to escape the pressures of their lives and rediscover the love that had once burned so brightly. But as he thought back on the evening, he couldn't ignore the way his gaze had lingered on Susan's radiant smile, or the ease with which Jake had made Victoria laugh. A knot tightened in his chest. What had started as a dream vacation was already feeling far more complicated than he'd anticipated. Chapter 2, The bonds begin to show cracks. The sun was high in the sky as the four vacationers strolled down the winding path toward the resort's private beach. Victoria walked a few steps ahead, her wide-brimmed hat shading her face, the sheer cover-up over her designer swimsuit billowing in the breeze. She exuded effortless grace, though her posture was stiff, her silence noticeable. Cruz followed close behind, his sunglasses concealing his gaze as he stole quick glances at Susan, who walked beside Jake. Her laughter floated through the air, light and unrestrained, a stark contrast to Victoria's composed demeanor. Susan was talking animatedly about the resort's amenities. "They have paddleboarding, snorkeling, scuba diving, you name it. I think we should try everything." She turned to Jake, her eyes bright with excitement. "Doesn't that sound fun?" Jake grinned. "Sure, but let's not forget the spa. I could use a massage after the year we've had." "Massage? You already live like you're retired," Cruz teased, clapping Jake on the back. "Someone has to enjoy life," Jake shot back, smirking. Victoria slowed her pace until she was walking beside Cruz. "I'd rather spend the day at the infinity pool," she said quietly, her voice betraying no enthusiasm. Cruz sighed. "We'll do whatever you want, Victoria." Her response was a small nod, but she didn't meet his eyes. The tension between them was palpable, and Cruz felt a familiar pang of frustration. He'd hoped the change of scenery would bring them closer, but so far, Victoria seemed as distant as ever. As they reached the beach, Susan broke into a jog, kicking off her sandals and letting out a laugh as the soft white sand engulfed her feet. "This is incredible. Look at that water." Jake followed her, shaking his head with a smile. "You're like a kid sometimes, you know that." "And you love it," Susan quipped, tossing a wink over her shoulder. Watching them, Cruz felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, envy, perhaps. Jake and Susan seemed to live in their own bubble, unaffected by the weight of the world. Their connection was so natural, so easy, and Cruz couldn't help but wonder where that had gone in his own marriage. Victoria found a shaded lounger and settled onto it, pulling a book from her bag. Cruz hesitated for a moment before joining her, though he had no intention of reading. Instead, he sat back and watched as Jake and Susan waded into the water. "They seem happy," Cruz said, his tone almost wistful. Victoria didn't look up. "They do." He waited for her to say more, but she didn't. Her focus remained on the pages in front of her, though Cruz doubted she was absorbing the words. "Do you ever think about how we used to be like that?" he asked, his voice low. This time, she glanced at him. Her expression was neutral, her dark eyes unreadable. "Do you?" The question caught him off guard, and he opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, he turned his attention back to the beach, where Susan was splashing Jake, her laughter infectious. Jake grabbed her around the waist, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "They look like they're having fun," Victoria said, her voice carrying a hint of something Cruz couldn't place: longing, perhaps, or maybe bitterness. Cruz didn't reply. Instead, he stood and walked toward the water, leaving Victoria alone on the lounger. Jake was the first to notice Cruz approaching. "Finally. I was starting to think you were afraid of getting wet." Cruz chuckled. "Not a chance." He waded in, the cool water lapping at his calves. Susan turned to him with a wide smile, her hair slicked back from her face. "Isn't this amazing?" "It is," Cruz admitted, though he wasn't sure if he was referring to the water or the way Susan's skin glistened in the sunlight. Jake stretched his arms behind his head, sighing contentedly. "This is what life's all about, my friend. No deadlines, no stress, just this." "For a week, at least," Cruz said, smirking. Jake laughed. "Fair enough. But that's why you've got to soak it all in while you can." Susan turned toward the shore, shading her eyes as she looked back at Victoria. "She doesn't want to come in." Cruz followed her gaze. "She's not much for the beach." "That's a shame," Susan said, her tone thoughtful. She glanced at Cruz. "Maybe she just needs a little convincing." Cruz shrugged, though the comment lingered in his mind. Had he stopped trying to convince Victoria of anything? Had he given up too easily? Susan reached down and splashed water at him, pulling him out of his thoughts. "Come on, Mr. Serious. Lighten up." Jake laughed, watching as Cruz retaliated with a splash of his own. The three of them fell into an easy rhythm, their laughter echoing across the beach. For a moment, Cruz forgot about the tension with Victoria. For a moment, it was just him, the water, and Susan's bright smile. Back on the lounger, Victoria lowered her book, watching the scene unfold in the water. Her grip on the pages tightened as she observed Cruz laughing with Susan, the way his posture softened, the way his focus was entirely on her. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly, but it was something close. She turned her gaze to Jake, who had waded back to the shore and was now sprawled out on the sand, his hands behind his head as he soaked up the sun. There was something oddly comforting about his presence, something steady and grounded that Cruz seemed to lack lately. Victoria closed her book and stood, brushing sand off her cover-up. If Cruz wanted to spend his time with Susan, so be it. She'd find her own way to enjoy the day. Walking toward Jake, she shaded her eyes with one hand. "Mind if I join you?" Jake opened one eye and grinned. "Not at all. It's a free beach." She sat beside him, folding her legs beneath her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "It's beautiful here," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "I can see why Cruz picked it. He's got a knack for finding the best of everything." Victoria smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes. He does." Jake turned his head to look at her. "You okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Just, Thinking. About what? Victoria met his gaze, her expression softening. About how long it's been since I felt this relaxed. Jake studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. You deserve it. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for the first time in a long while, Victoria felt truly seen. Chapter 3, a tension-filled dinner. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky painted in hues of amber and lavender as the couples gathered in the villa's shared dining area for their first official dinner together. The butler had prepared a feast fit for royalty: grilled lobster tails, roasted vegetables drizzled with balsamic glaze, saffron rice, and an assortment of tropical desserts. The heady aroma of spices and fresh seafood filled the air, complemented by the soft strains of jazz emanating from hidden speakers. Cruz poured wine for everyone, his movements precise, but his mood seemed distracted. He'd spent most of the day trying to shake off the unease he felt after the afternoon at the beach. Something about the way Victoria and Jake had lingered on the sand together gnawed at him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. I have to hand it to you, Cruz, Jake said, raising his glass. You've outdone yourself. This place is incredible. To good friends, Cruz said, clinking his glass against Jake's, then Susan's. He hesitated briefly before touching glasses with Victoria, her cool expression unchanged. As they began eating, the conversation ebbed and flowed. Susan was the most animated of the group, regaling everyone with stories of her adventures as a travel blogger. Did I tell you about the time I got lost in Morocco? She asked, her eyes sparkling. I ended up in the middle of a spice market, completely clueless. Jake had to bribe a vendor just to get me out. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. You make it sound like I dragged you kicking and screaming. You were having the time of your life. I was, Susan admitted, grinning. But you still saved the day. Cruz couldn't help but admire the ease with which they interacted. Jake and Susan's relationship had its quirks, but they seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company. The contrast with his own marriage was stark. He glanced at Victoria, who was quietly cutting her lobster tail into perfect pieces. What about you, Victoria? Susan asked suddenly, turning her attention to her. Have you ever had an adventure like that? Victoria looked up, startled by the question. She dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin before replying. Not really, she said. My life has been structured. Cruz likes things planned out. Cruz frowned at her tone, which bordered on accusatory. You've never complained about that before, he said. Victoria gave him a thin smile. Maybe I should have. An awkward silence fell over the table. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Susan took a long sip of her wine, her earlier cheer dimmed. Well, Jake said, clearing his throat, there's something to be said for spontaneity. Some of the best moments in life are unplanned. Victoria glanced at him, her expression softening. I suppose that's true. Cruz felt his jaw tighten as he watched the brief exchange. There was a warmth in Jake's voice when he spoke to Victoria, a subtle attentiveness that Cruz found increasingly irritating. He drained his wine glass and reached for the bottle to pour himself another. Susan, ever the peacemaker, tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics. So, Cruz, tell me what's the secret to running such a successful business and still managing to take vacations like this? Cruz forced a smile. Delegation, he said. Surround yourself with the right people, and things run smoothly even when you're not there. Susan leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. You make it sound so easy. I can barely keep up with my blog, and that's just me and a laptop. Maybe you need an assistant, Cruz suggested. Or a partner. Jake raised an eyebrow, smirking. Careful, Cruz. You're about to give her ideas. The table erupted in laughter, the tension momentarily broken. Even Victoria smiled faintly, though her eyes remained distant. A private moment on the terrace after dinner. The group moved to the terrace, where the butler had set up a bar with an array of tropical cocktails. The night was warm, the air alive with the chirping of crickets and the gentle rustle of palm trees. Cruz leaned against the railing, sipping his rum punch as he watched the others. Jake and Susan were seated on a cushioned bench, their heads close together as they whispered and laughed. Victoria stood a few feet away, her arms crossed as she gazed out at the ocean. Her profile was illuminated by the soft glow of the lanterns, and Cruz was struck by how ethereal she looked, yet so far removed from him. He walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Victoria," he said softly. "Are you okay?" She didn't turn to look at him. "I'm fine. You've been quiet tonight." She sighed, finally meeting his gaze. I feel like we've lost something, Cruz. And I don't know how to get it back." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he stood there, his hand slipping from her shoulder. A dangerous spark. Meanwhile, Susan had excused herself to refresh her drink, leaving Jake alone on the terrace. As Victoria walked back inside, Jake caught her eye and gave her a small, knowing smile. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" he said. Victoria hesitated before nodding. "Yes. It is." She walked over to the railing, standing beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You know," Jake said, his tone thoughtful, "it's easy to take moments like this for granted. But they're rare. Sometimes you have to grab them before they slip away." Victoria turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Do you really believe that?" Jake met her gaze, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. "I do." Victoria felt her breath catch, a strange mixture of guilt and exhilaration swirling within her. She looked away quickly, her fingers tightening on the railing. Inside, Susan reappeared with a fresh cocktail, her laughter floating through the open doors. Victoria stepped back, putting distance between herself and Jake. "I should go," she said abruptly, walking back inside without another word. Jake watched her go, his jaw tightening as he fought the conflicting emotions brewing inside him. Chapter 4, Crossing Unspoken Boundaries. The sun cast a golden glow over the horizon as the second morning of their tropical getaway began. Breakfast was served on the villa's breezy terrace, with the scent of freshly baked croissants and tropical fruit mingling with the salty air. Despite the idyllic setting, an invisible tension lingered among the four. Susan was the first to break the silence, her voice cheerful but forced. "So, what's the plan for today? Are we finally trying paddleboarding?" Jake smirked over his coffee. "I'm not sure Cruz is ready to balance on anything other than his wallet." Cruz chuckled, though the humor didn't quite reach his eyes. "I think I'll stick to something less likely to end with me in the water. Maybe a game of beach volleyball." "I'm in," Susan said quickly, flashing him a grin. Victoria glanced up from her untouched plate of papaya. "I'll pass. I think I'd rather spend some time at the spa." Jake turned to her, his tone warm. "Mind if I join? I've been meaning to try one of those deep tissue massages." Victoria hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. She could feel Cruz's eyes on her, and a strange guilt crept up her spine. But Jake's expression was so open, so easy, that she found herself nodding. "Of course. It's supposed to be wonderful." Susan raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her smile tight. Cruz leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. A volleyball game of subtle rivalry. Cruz and Susan walked down to the beach after breakfast, the sun warm on their backs and the ocean glittering invitingly before them. Cruz carried the volleyball, his jaw set, his mood inexplicably sour. "I hope you're ready to lose," Susan teased, tugging her hair into a ponytail. Cruz smirked, tossing the ball into the air and catching it. "We'll see about that." They set up the game with the resort's staff, enlisting 2 young attendants to join their teams. As the match began, Cruz couldn't help but notice how easily Susan moved on the sand, her laughter ringing out every time she scored a point. Her energy was infectious, and for the first time in a while, Cruz found himself genuinely smiling. But as the game wore on, his competitive edge kicked in. He dived for every ball, spiked with precision, and celebrated every win with a little too much enthusiasm. Susan, undeterred, matched his energy, her playful taunts keeping him on his toes. "Is that all you've got, Mr. Billionaire?" she called out after landing a perfect serve. "Just warming up," Cruz shot back, wiping sweat from his brow. The match ended in a narrow victory for Susan's team. She threw her arms in the air, laughing triumphantly. "Admit it, you didn't think I could beat you." Cruz shook his head, his chest rising and falling with exertion. "I'll admit nothing. But I'll buy you a drink for the effort." "Deal," Susan said, her smile lingering a moment too long. The spa's lingering intimacy. Meanwhile, Victoria and Jake were guided into the resort's opulent spa, where the scent of eucalyptus and lavender filled the air. The soft lighting and tranquil music created an atmosphere of intimacy that neither of them could ignore. They were led into adjacent treatment rooms for their massages, but when Jake caught Victoria's eye just before the doors closed, she felt a jolt of something. Anticipation, perhaps? The massage was blissful, and for the first time in months, Victoria felt her tension ease. But as the therapist worked, her thoughts kept drifting to Jake's presence just beyond the thin wall separating them. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, the way his kindness and charm seemed to fill a void she hadn't realized was there. When the session ended, Victoria emerged to find Jake waiting for her, his expression relaxed but his eyes sharp. "That was incredible," he said, running a hand through his hair. "It was," Victoria agreed, her voice softer than she intended. They walked back toward the villa together, the conversation flowing easily. Jake told her stories about his business ventures, his voice animated and warm. Victoria found herself laughing, something she hadn't done much of lately. "You're different here," Jake said suddenly, his tone quieter. Victoria tilted her head, curious. "Different how?" "Lighter," Jake said. "Happier." "It suits you." The compliment caught her off guard, and she glanced away, unsure how to respond. An afternoon interruption. When they returned to the villa, the sight of Cruz and Susan laughing together by the pool stopped them in their tracks. Susan was perched on the edge of a lounge chair, her wet hair glistening in the sunlight, while Cruz leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed in a way Victoria hadn't seen in years. "Looks like someone had fun," Jake remarked, his tone light but his jaw tightening imperceptibly. Cruz looked up, his smile fading slightly as he took in the sight of Victoria and Jake together. "How was the spa?" "Relaxing," Victoria said, her voice even. Jake nodded. "You should try it, Cruz. Might help you loosen up." Cruz's gaze lingered on Jake for a moment longer than necessary. "I'm perfectly fine, thanks." Susan, sensing the shift in mood, stood and wrapped a towel around her shoulders. "We were just about to order lunch. Care to join us?" Victoria hesitated, but Jake spoke first. "Sure. I'm starving." Unspoken words at lunch. Lunch was a quiet affair, the earlier camaraderie replaced by a strange undercurrent of tension. Cruz kept his eyes on his plate, while Victoria seemed lost in thought. Susan tried to keep the conversation going, but her efforts felt forced, and Jake's responses were clipped. At one point, Cruz looked up, his gaze locking with Victoria's. "Do you want to do something together this afternoon?" he asked, his tone almost pleading. Victoria hesitated, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on her. "Maybe," she said finally. "I'll let you know." Cruz's expression hardened, and he returned to his meal without another word. A private confrontation later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Cruz found himself alone with Susan on the terrace. The others had gone to their rooms, leaving the two of them with a bottle of wine and the sound of waves crashing in the distance. Are you okay? Susan asked, tilting her head. Cruz sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Honestly? I don't know. Susan leaned closer, her voice gentle. Talk to me. For a moment, Cruz hesitated. But then the words spilled out his frustration with Victoria, his confusion about their distance, and his growing doubts about their future. Susan listened intently, her expression soft. You're too hard on yourself, she said finally. Relationships go through rough patches. It doesn't mean it's over. Cruz looked at her, his eyes searching hers. You really believe that? Susan nodded, her gaze unwavering. I do. The moment stretched between them, charged with an energy neither of them could deny. Cruz glanced away first, clearing his throat. Thanks, Susan. I needed that. She smiled, though her heart raced. Anytime. As they sat there, the night wrapping around them like a cloak, the boundaries of their friendship began to blur, setting the stage for what was to come. This expanded chapter builds on the tension and emotional entanglements between the characters, highlighting the small moments that lead to larger betrayals. Chapter 5, Secrets Beneath the Surface. The third day on the island began with a deceptive calm. The sun rose over the crystalline waters, bathing the villa in warm, golden light. But beneath the picturesque tranquility, the tension between the four was beginning to ripple like an unseen current, pulling them toward dangerous waters. Victoria woke up early, the soft hum of the ocean outside her window doing little to soothe the unease that had taken root in her chest. She lingered in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the events of the previous days, the growing rift with Cruz, the unexpected connection she felt with Jake. She hated the guilt that gnawed at her, yet she couldn't deny the small spark of excitement his presence brought. Downstairs, Cruz was already awake, seated on the terrace with his tablet, though his attention was far from the screen. He kept glancing toward the staircase, hoping to catch a glimpse of Victoria. Their conversation from the previous night weighed heavily on his mind, but he didn't know how to bridge the widening gap between them. When Susan appeared instead, her bright smile briefly lifted his mood. Morning, Cruz, she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Morning, he replied, his voice warm. Sleep well. Like a rock. This place is paradise, Susan said, leaning against the railing. She tilted her head, studying him. You don't look like someone enjoying paradise, though. Cruz forced a chuckle. Just got a lot on my mind. Susan hesitated, then reached out to touch his arm lightly. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. Cruz looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. For a moment, he considered opening up to her, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted them. Victoria emerged, her hair still damp from a quick shower. She froze briefly at the sight of Cruz and Susan standing so close, but quickly masked her reaction. Good morning, she said, her tone neutral. Morning, Cruz said, stepping back instinctively. An unexpected pairing later that morning, Jake suggested a group outing to the island's famous hidden lagoon. It's supposed to be incredible, he said, showing them photos on his phone. Everyone agreed, though the mood remained slightly strained. By the time they arrived at the lagoon, the tension had eased somewhat, the breathtaking scenery providing a temporary distraction. The water was a deep turquoise, surrounded by lush greenery and towering cliffs that echoed with the sounds of tropical birds. They decided to rent kayaks to explore the lagoon. As they paired off, Susan instinctively moved toward Jake, but he hesitated. Why don't you and Cruz go together, he suggested, glancing at Victoria. Victoria looked at Cruz, who was already watching her, his expression unreadable. She nodded, though a flicker of anxiety crossed her face. Sure. Navigating rough waters, Victoria and Cruz paddled out in one kayak, their movements awkward at first as they struggled to find a rhythm. Cruz, usually so confident, seemed uncharacteristically unsure of himself. Relax, Victoria said, her voice soft but firm. You're overthinking it. Cruz exhaled sharply. That's what I do, isn't it? Overthink everything. Victoria paused, her paddle resting on the water. I didn't mean it like that. Didn't you? Cruz said, his tone tinged with frustration. Lately, it feels like everything I do is wrong in your eyes. That's not true, Victoria said, though her voice lacked conviction. Then tell me what is true, Cruz pressed. Because I feel like I'm losing you, Victoria. And I don't know how to stop it. Victoria swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the water. She wanted to tell him everything that she felt unseen, unappreciated, and that Jake's attention had filled a void she hadn't realized existed. But the words stuck in her throat. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe we've both lost sight of each other. Cruz didn't respond, his jaw tightening as he resumed paddling. A growing connection in the second kayak. Susan and Jake paddled in perfect harmony, their laughter carrying across the lagoon. I can't believe you actually convinced me to do this, Susan said, grinning. Jake smirked. What can I say? I have a way of getting people to trust me. Susan rolled her eyes, though her smile didn't waver. You're lucky you're charming. As they explored a secluded cove, Jake grew quieter, his gaze thoughtful. Do you ever feel like? I don't know, like you're missing something, he asked suddenly. Susan blinked, caught off guard by the question. What do you mean? Jake shrugged, his paddle slicing through the water. Like there's a part of you that's been dormant for so long, you're not sure it even exists anymore. Susan's smile faltered, and she looked away. Sometimes, she admitted. But I try not to dwell on it. What's the point? Jake studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Maybe the point is figuring out how to wake it up. Susan didn't reply, but his words lingered in her mind long after they returned to shore. A disquieting discovery after the lagoon excursion, the group returned to the villa, sun-kissed and tired. Victoria excused herself to take a nap, while Cruz retreated to his office to check emails. Susan wandered to the terrace, a glass of wine in hand, and Jake soon joined her. They sat in silence for a while, the air between them charged. Finally, Jake spoke. Do you think they're happy? Susan glanced at him, startled. Who? Cruz and Victoria, Jake said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Susan hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. Everyone has their struggles, right? Jake nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. It's just, sometimes I wonder if they're with the right people. Susan's breath caught, and she turned to him sharply. Jake, what are you saying? Before he could respond, the sound of Cruz's voice calling for them interrupted the moment. Jake smiled faintly, standing and offering Susan a hand. Nothing. Forget I said anything. But Susan couldn't forget. The seed of doubt he had planted was already beginning to grow. A crack in the facade that evening, during a casual dinner at the villa, the underlying tension bubbled to the surface. Cruz, already on edge, made a pointed comment about Jake's laid-back approach to life. Must be nice not to worry about responsibility, Cruz said, his tone biting. Jake raised an eyebrow, his smile tight. Must be exhausting to worry about everything. Victoria's eyes flicked between them, her chest tightening. Can we not do this? She said quietly. Susan forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. You two sound like an old married couple. The comment drew laughter from Jake, but Cruz's expression darkened. The dinner ended on a strained note, with everyone retreating to their respective corners of the villa. A moment of weakness later that night, Cruz found himself wandering to the terrace, where he found Susan sitting alone, her knees drawn to her chest. Couldn't sleep? He asked, leaning against the railing. Susan shook her head. Too much on my mind. Cruz sat beside her, the silence between them comfortable but charged. "You've been a good friend, Susan," he said quietly. She turned to him, her expression soft. "So have you." For a moment, the world seemed to shrink around them, the boundaries of their friendship blurring as they shared a look that lingered too long. Cruz stood abruptly, clearing his throat. "I should go." Susan nodded, her heart pounding as she watched him walk away. Chapter 6, the spark that ignites. The following day dawned brighter than ever, the tropical sun casting long golden beams over the villa. The idyllic setting, however, was at odds with the turmoil brewing within its walls. The four friends were navigating increasingly murky waters, their relationships shifting in ways none of them had anticipated. Victoria rose before Cruz that morning, leaving the bedroom quietly. She felt stifled by the silence between them, a silence that had grown more oppressive with each passing day. She craved clarity but wasn't sure where to find it. The memory of her easy conversation with Jake lingered, though she pushed it aside with guilt gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. Jake, meanwhile, was already at the villa's infinity pool, doing laps with an almost punishing intensity. He welcomed the burn in his muscles, the rhythmic motion distracting him from the storm of emotions swirling in his chest. He didn't want to admit it, even to himself, but his feelings for Victoria were becoming harder to ignore. Breakfast tensions. By the time the group gathered for breakfast, the air was thick with unspoken words. Victoria seated herself next to Cruz, but her movements were stiff, her attention fixed on her plate. Jake and Susan, meanwhile, sat opposite each other, exchanging quiet smiles that hinted at a shared secret. Cruz noticed the glances but said nothing, his jaw tightening as he poured himself another cup of coffee. His unease with Jake was growing, though he couldn't quite articulate why. "So," Jake said, breaking the silence, "anyone up for a sailing trip today? The resort has a private yacht we can charter." Victoria's eyes lit up, though she tried to suppress her enthusiasm. "That sounds amazing." Cruz hesitated, his initial instinct to decline warring with his desire to keep Victoria close. "Sure," he said finally. "Let's do it." Susan clapped her hands together. "Great! I've always wanted to sail." Setting sail. The yacht was a masterpiece of modern luxury, all sleek lines and gleaming wood. As they boarded, the crew welcomed them with champagne and light hors d'oeuvres. The breeze carried the scent of salt and freedom, and for a moment, the group seemed to relax. Jake took charge immediately, chatting with the captain about the best spots to explore. Cruz watched him, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He wasn't used to being overshadowed, and Jake's easy charm grated on his nerves. As the yacht sailed into open waters, the group spread out. Susan perched on the bow, letting the wind whip through her hair, while Victoria leaned against the railing, her gaze lost in the horizon. Jake joined her, his voice low. "You look like you're a million miles away." Victoria glanced at him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Maybe I am." "You know," Jake said, leaning in slightly, "this place suits you. You seem freer here." Victoria's pulse quickened, though she kept her tone light. "Is that your way of saying I'm uptight back home?" Jake chuckled. "Not at all. I'm just saying it's nice to see you like this." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to fall away. Then Cruz's voice called out from behind them, breaking the spell. "Jake, help me with the fishing gear," Cruz said, his tone sharp. Jake straightened, the easy smile returning to his face. "Be right there." As he walked away, Victoria turned back to the water, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. Lines crossed. The afternoon passed with relative ease, the group lounging on the deck and sharing stories over glasses of chilled wine. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the atmosphere shifted. Susan, emboldened by the wine and the intoxicating beauty of the moment, found herself drawn to Cruz. She watched him from across the deck, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes. She wanted to comfort him, to ease whatever burden he was carrying. "Cruz," she said softly, approaching him as he stood by the railing. "Are you okay?" Cruz looked at her, startled by the question. "Yeah, I'm fine." "You don't seem fine," Susan said, her voice gentle. "You've been carrying something this whole trip. Maybe it would help to talk about it." Cruz hesitated, then sighed. "It's Victoria. Things between us haven't been right for a while now." Susan nodded, her heart aching for him. "I know how that feels." Cruz turned to her, surprised. "You and Jake?" Susan shrugged, her gaze distant. "Jake's great, but sometimes I feel like I'm just part of his routine. Like I'm not enough to hold his attention anymore." Their eyes met, the shared vulnerability creating a connection neither of them had expected. "You deserve more," Cruz said quietly. "So do you," Susan replied. The moment hung between them, charged and dangerous. Then Susan stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should probably head back." Cruz nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irrevocably. Storm brewing as the yacht returned to the dock, the group was unusually quiet. Victoria watched Cruz and Susan from the corner of her eye, noticing how close they stood, their heads bent in quiet conversation. A pang of jealousy surprised her, though she quickly pushed it aside. Jake, meanwhile, was watching Victoria, his own thoughts a tangled mess. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the growing distance between them, but he knew the risks. When they arrived back at the villa, the group scattered, each retreating to their own space. Victoria found herself in the garden, the night air cool against her skin. She was startled when Jake appeared, his expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She nodded, though her heart raced as he stepped closer. "I've been wanting to talk to you," Jake said, his voice low. "About us?" Victoria froze. "What about us?" Jake hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I know this is complicated, but I can't ignore how I feel. When I'm with you, it's like everything makes sense." Victoria's chest tightened, her emotions warring with her better judgment. "Jake, we can I know," Jake said, cutting her off. "But that doesn't change the fact that I care about you." Victoria looked away, her thoughts spinning. She wanted to tell him to stop, to draw a line they wouldn't cross, but the words wouldn't come. Unseen shadows from the villa's terrace, Cruz stood in the shadows, watching the scene unfold. His heart sank as he saw Jake lean in closer to Victoria, their silhouettes outlined by the moonlight. He clenched his fists, a mix of anger and hurt flooding his chest. He turned away before he could see more, retreating to the living room where Susan sat, nursing a glass of wine. "Everything okay?" she asked, concern flickering in her eyes. Cruz hesitated, then shook his head. "Not really." Susan moved closer, her voice soft. "Do you want to talk about it?" Cruz looked at her, the weight of the evening pressing down on him. "I don't know what to do anymore, Susan." She reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight." Their eyes met, and once again, the line between friendship and something more began to blur. Chapter 7, The Fraying Threads. The villa seemed quieter than usual the next morning, as if the walls themselves were bracing for the inevitable storms. The sun's bright rays filtered through gauzy curtains, but the warmth did little to dissolve the chill in the air between the four friends. Victoria woke with a dull ache behind her eyes, a symptom of the restless night she had spent tossing and turning. Jake's confession replayed in her mind on an endless loop, his words mingling with the guilt she felt every time she glanced at Cruz. Meanwhile, Cruz was already up, pacing the terrace with his coffee cup clutched tightly in his hands. He hadn't slept much either, haunted by the sight of Jake and Victoria the previous evening. His thoughts veered between anger and self-doubt, questioning not only Victoria's loyalty but also his own actions with Susan. In the kitchen, Susan prepared breakfast with mechanical efficiency, her mind far away. She was aware of the undercurrents swirling among them and couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something irreversible. Jake was the last to emerge, his usual confidence dampened by the weight of his own choices. He greeted everyone with his trademark grin, but it lacked its usual spark. An uneasy meal breakfast was a strained affair, the clinking of cutlery against plates the only sound for long stretches. Susan attempted to fill the silence with light conversation about the day's plans, but her words fell flat. "So, I was thinking we could check out the market in town," she said brightly, her gaze darting between Cruz and Victoria. Victoria nodded, grateful for the distraction. "That sounds nice. We haven't seen much of the local culture yet." Cruz grunted in agreement, his eyes on Jake. "Sure. A trip to the market sounds great." Jake smirked, sensing the edge in Cruz's tone. "I'm game," he said. "Maybe I'll find something to take back as a souvenir." The tension was palpable, and Victoria excused herself early, muttering something about needing to change. Jake watched her leave, his jaw tightening. Cruz's eyes followed Jake's line of sight, his suspicion hardening into something sharper. The market excursion. The market was a riot of colors, sounds, and smells. Stalls overflowed with vibrant textiles, handmade jewelry, and aromatic spices. Street performers entertained crowds with acrobatics and music, adding to the festive atmosphere. For a time, the group seemed to forget their troubles, splitting off in pairs to explore. Victoria and Susan wandered to a stall selling delicate shell necklaces, while Cruz and Jake gravitated toward a booth displaying intricate carvings. As Victoria tried on a necklace, Susan studied her friend carefully. "You've been quiet this morning," she said. Victoria hesitated, her fingers brushing the cool shells of the necklace. "Just tired, I guess." Susan arched an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's all it is?" Victoria glanced at her, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" Susan shrugged, her tone casual but her gaze sharp. "I've noticed the way Jake looks at you. And the way you avoid looking back." Victoria's cheeks flushed, and she fumbled with the necklace. "It's not like that. Isn't it?" Susan asked softly. Before Victoria could respond, Jake appeared, holding up a carved wooden figurine. "What do you think?" he asked, his smile directed at Victoria. She forced a laugh, grateful for the interruption. "It's nice." Susan watched the exchange, her suspicions confirmed. A brewing confrontation later, as the group regrouped near a CAF, Cruz's patience snapped. Jake's easy charm, the shared glances between him and Victoria, and the weight of his own guilt were too much to bear. "Enjoying yourself, Jake?" Cruz asked, his voice deceptively calm. Jake raised an eyebrow, sensing the challenge. "I'd say so. It's a beautiful day." "Glad to hear it," Cruz said, his tone sharpening. "You seem to be having a little too much fun, though." The others froze, the undercurrent of hostility impossible to miss. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake asked, his smile fading. Cruz took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You know exactly what I mean." Victoria stepped between them, her voice trembling. "Cruz, stop. This isn't the time or place." Jake smirked, though his eyes remained cold. If Cruz has something to say, he should say it. Cruz clenched his fists, but before he could respond, Susan intervened. "Enough, both of you," she said firmly. "We're supposed to be on vacation, not tearing each other apart." Her words diffused the situation, but the tension lingered as the group returned to the villa. Fractures deepened that evening, the villa felt suffocating, the earlier confrontation casting a long shadow. Cruz retreated to his study, nursing a glass of whiskey as he stared out at the darkened ocean. His thoughts churned, a mix of anger, betrayal, and his own unspoken feelings for Susan. Victoria, meanwhile, sought solace in the garden, the cool night air doing little to soothe her frayed nerves. She hadn't meant for things to spiral out of control, but she couldn't deny the part she had played in it. Jake found her there, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Victoria nodded, though tears pricked at her eyes. "I didn't want this. Any of it." Jake hesitated, then stepped closer. "It's not your fault, Victoria. Cruz has been pushing you away for years. You deserve more." His words hit a nerve, and Victoria turned to him, her emotions spilling over. "And what do you think I deserve, Jake?" "You." Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then he reached for her hand, his touch warm against her cool skin. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe we're what each other needs." Victoria pulled her hand away, shaking her head. "This has to stop. We can't do this." Jake sighed, stepping back. "I'll give you space, but don't pretend you don't feel it too." He left her alone in the garden, her heart pounding in her chest. Lines blurred inside. Susan found Cruz in the study, his glass nearly empty. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice tentative. Cruz gestured to the chair across from him. "Be my guest." They sat in silence for a while, the unspoken words between them growing louder with each passing moment. Finally, Susan broke the silence. "You're not okay," she said softly. Cruz chuckled bitterly. "Is it that obvious?" Susan leaned forward, her gaze steady. "I know how it feels to doubt everything. To wonder if the person you're with is who they're meant to be." Cruz looked at her, the vulnerability in her voice surprising him. "Is that how you feel with Jake?" Susan hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes." Their eyes locked, and the air between them shifted. Cruz reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Susan," he began, but she shook her head. "Don't," she whispered, though she didn't pull away. The moment stretched, the boundaries of their friendship blurring once again. This chapter explores the deepening fractures among the characters, with the tension between Cruz and Jake reaching a boiling point and the emotional entanglements between the couples growing more complex. Chapter 8, Shadows of Desire. The villa was steeped in an uneasy quiet the following morning. The tension from the previous day lingered like an unwelcome guest, casting a shadow over the group. Each of them carried the weight of secrets, unspoken words, and desires they were too afraid to acknowledge fully. Victoria sat on the patio with a cup of coffee, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The salty breeze tousled her hair, but it did little to ease the turmoil in her heart. She replayed Jake's words in her mind, his insistence that they shared something real. It was reckless, dangerous, and entirely wrong, but part of her couldn't deny it. Susan appeared in the doorway, hesitating for a moment before stepping outside. "Mind if I join you?" Victoria glanced at her, forcing a smile. "Of course not." The two women sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between them palpable. Finally, Susan broke the silence. "Victoria, is everything okay with you and Cruz?" Victoria froze, her fingers tightening around her mug. "Why do you ask?" Susan shrugged, her expression unreadable. "I've just noticed, you seem distant lately. I'm worried about you." Victoria hesitated, torn between confiding in Susan and keeping her secrets buried. "We've been going through a rough patch," she admitted finally. "But it's nothing we can't work through." Susan nodded, though her eyes held a flicker of doubt. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." Victoria offered a faint smile, but the weight of her own dishonesty made it feel hollow. A chance encounter later that morning, Cruz and Jake decided to go for a run along the beach. The rhythmic pounding of their feet against the sand did little to mask the tension between them. "You've been acting strange, Jake," Cruz said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jake smirked, though his tone was sharp. "Strange how?" Cruz stopped, turning to face him. "You know exactly what I mean. I see the way you look at Victoria. Jake's smile faded, replaced by a cool defiance. And how do you look at Susan? Cruz's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. Don't turn this around on me. Jake shrugged, his tone casual but laced with warning. Maybe we should both be careful about crossing lines, Cruz. The tension crackled between them, but neither man made a move. Finally, Cruz turned and began jogging back toward the villa, leaving Jake alone on the beach. Private confessions. Victoria spent the afternoon wandering the garden, seeking solace among the vibrant flowers and lush greenery. She was startled when Jake appeared, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, he said, his voice low. Victoria shook her head, backing away. No, we don't. We've already said too much. Jake stepped closer, his gaze intense. Ignoring this won't make it go away. You feel it too, I know you do. Victoria's resolve wavered as her heart raced. Jake, this is wrong. We can't do this. Why not? He challenged. You deserve to be happy, Victoria. When was the last time Cruz made you feel that way? His words struck a nerve, and tears welled in her eyes. This isn't just about me. There's too much at stake. Jake reached for her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. You don't have to decide anything now. Just, think about it. Victoria pulled away, her emotions in turmoil. As she turned and walked back toward the villa, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. Unraveling bonds. That evening, the four of them gathered for dinner on the terrace, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Despite the beauty of the moment, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Cruz tried to focus on his meal, but his gaze kept drifting to Susan. She seemed distracted, her eyes flickering toward him more often than not. Meanwhile, Jake and Victoria avoided looking at each other entirely, their silence speaking volumes. Halfway through the meal, Cruz set down his fork with a clatter. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Are we all just going to sit here pretending nothing's wrong? Victoria stiffened, her cheeks flushing. What are you talking about? Cruz's eyes narrowed as he looked at Jake. You know exactly what I mean. Jake met his gaze evenly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Careful, Cruz. You don't want to say something you'll regret. Susan's eyes darted between them, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. What's going on here? Before Cruz could respond, Victoria pushed back her chair and stood abruptly. Excuse me, she said, her voice trembling. I need some air. She disappeared into the house, leaving the others in tense silence. Lines crossed. Later that night, Cruz found himself in the study once again, nursing a glass of whiskey. He was startled when Susan appeared in the doorway, her expression hesitant. I thought you might be here, she said softly. Cruz gestured for her to come in, and she closed the door behind her before taking a seat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Susan broke the silence. Cruz, are you okay? He chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. Does it look like I'm okay? Susan leaned forward, her gaze steady. You can talk to me, you know. I won't judge. Cruz met her eyes, and for the first time, he let his guard down. I don't know what to do anymore, Susan. Everything feels like it's falling apart. She reached out, resting her hand on his. You're not alone in this. Their eyes locked, and the distance between them seemed to disappear. Cruz hesitated, then leaned closer, his breath mingling with hers. Susan, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. She closed her eyes, torn between her loyalty to Jake and the undeniable connection she felt with Cruz. When their lips met, it was hesitant at first, a tentative exploration of a line they both knew they shouldn't cross. But as the kiss deepened, all thoughts of consequence faded, leaving only the moment. Chapter 9, the invitation the day began with an air of forced normalcy as the two couples prepared for a yoga class at a nearby wellness retreat. Susan had suggested it over breakfast, hoping a shared activity might ease the tension that had become impossible to ignore. Cruz and Jake agreed reluctantly, while Victoria welcomed the distraction. The retreat was nestled amidst lush greenery, a serene haven designed to soothe even the most frazzled of minds. The open-air yoga studio overlooked the ocean, with the rhythmic sound of waves providing a calming backdrop. The instructor, a lithe woman with an air of calm authority, guided the class into a series of stretches and poses designed to promote mindfulness and relaxation. For a while, the couples seemed to lose themselves in the practice. Cruz and Jake, both competitive by nature, found themselves silently vying to master the challenging poses, while Susan and Victoria exchanged amused glances at their efforts. It was a rare moment of levity amidst the growing unease. But the tranquility was short-lived. Meeting Bayor and Mary as the class ended and the group gathered their belongings, they were approached by another couple who had also been part of the session. The man, Bayor, was tall and striking, exuding confidence and charm. His wife, Mary, was equally magnetic, her vibrant smile and infectious energy drawing attention wherever she went. "You two were killing it in that crow pose," Bayor said, addressing Cruz and Jake with a grin. "I'm impressed." Jake smirked. "It's all about balance. Right, Cruz?" Cruz gave a non-committal nod, his gaze flicking briefly to Mary, who was chatting animatedly with Susan and Victoria. "I'm Bayor, by the way," the man continued, extending a hand. "And this is my wife, Mary." Introductions were exchanged, and soon the six of them were deep in conversation. Bayor and Mary were vacationing at a nearby resort, celebrating their anniversary with a mix of relaxation and indulgence. Their easy banter and infectious laughter seemed to lighten the mood, and for the first time in days, the tension between the two couples began to ebb. The invitation as the group prepared to part ways, Bayor flashed a mischievous grin. "We're throwing a little party tonight at our villa. Nothing too crazy, just good drinks, good music, and good company. You all should come." Mary chimed in, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It'll be fun. You can't spend your entire vacation doing yoga and sipping green juice." The four friends exchanged uncertain glances. Victoria hesitated, unsure if a party was the right move given the undercurrents brewing among them. But Susan, ever the social butterfly, was quick to respond. "That sounds amazing. We'd love to come." Jake and Cruz exchanged a look, their unspoken rivalry momentarily set aside as they both nodded in agreement. "Great," Mary said, clapping her hands. "We'll send you the details. See you tonight." As Bayor and Mary walked away, their laughter trailing behind them, Victoria turned to Susan with a wary expression. "Are you sure about this?" Susan smiled, her optimism unshaken. "It'll be good for us. Maybe a little fun is exactly what we need." Preparations back at their villa, the group prepared for the evening with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Victoria chose a simple yet elegant dress, her nerves heightened by the uncertainty of what the night would bring. Susan, ever confident, opted for a bold, form-fitting outfit that drew admiring glances from Cruz and Jake alike. Cruz and Jake, meanwhile, shared a bottle of whiskey as they dressed, the alcohol doing little to smooth the tension between them. "You really think this party is a good idea?" Cruz asked, adjusting his cufflinks. Jake shrugged. "Why not? It's better than sitting around here stewing in our own drama." Cruz's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, focusing instead on the task at hand. The wild party Bayor and Mary's villa was a striking blend of opulence and modern design, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the ocean. The party was already in full swing when the four friends arrived, the air alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Bayor greeted them warmly, his charm as magnetic as ever. "Glad you made it. Grab a drink, make yourselves at home." Mary appeared moments later, a cocktail in hand. "You all look fantastic. Come, let me introduce you to some people." The night unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. Cruz found himself drawn into a conversation with Bayor about business ventures, their shared ambition creating a surprising camaraderie. Susan, ever the social butterfly, mingled effortlessly, her laughter ringing out as she charmed everyone she met. Victoria, meanwhile, found herself gravitating toward Mary, whose vibrant personality was both captivating and disarming. "You're quiet," Mary observed, her tone warm. "But I can tell you've got a lot on your mind." Victoria smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. "It's been an eventful trip." Mary studied her for a moment, then leaned closer. "Let me give you some advice, don't overthink things. Life's too short for regrets." Temptation unleashed. As the night wore on, the party grew wilder. The music grew louder, the drinks stronger, and the atmosphere more uninhibited. Bayor and Mary seemed to revel in pushing boundaries, their flirtatious energy sparking a sense of freedom and danger in their guests. At one point, Bayor led a small group, including Cruz and Jake, to the villa's rooftop terrace, where cigars and rare whiskey awaited. The conversation turned playful, then provocative, as Bayor challenged them to let loose and embrace the night. "You only live once," he said, raising his glass. "Why hold back?" Downstairs, Mary led Susan and Victoria to a secluded corner where she offered them a taste of an exotic cocktail. The drink was potent, its effects almost immediate. Mary's laughter was infectious, and soon the three women were caught up in a game of truth or dare, the questions growing bolder with each round. Susan, emboldened by the alcohol and the atmosphere, leaned into the moment, her usual inhibition slipping away. Victoria, though more reserved, found herself swept up in the energy of the night, her guarded exterior beginning to crack. Crossroads. As the party reached its peak, the boundaries between the couples began to blur. Jake found himself watching Victoria with a renewed intensity, his resolve weakening with each passing moment. Cruz, meanwhile, couldn't ignore the magnetic pull he felt toward Susan, her laughter and warmth drawing him in despite his better judgment. Bayor and Mary seemed to sense the unspoken tensions, their knowing smiles suggesting they had orchestrated the evening with purpose. "Sometimes," Bayor said quietly to Cruz as the two men stood on the terrace, "it takes a little chaos to see what you really want." Cruz's gaze drifted to Susan, who was laughing with Mary and Victoria below. His chest tightened, the truth of Bayor's words hitting him harder than he cared to admit. The aftermath. As the party wound down in the early hours of the morning, the couples returned to their villa in silence. The wild energy of the night had given way to a heavy stillness, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Victoria slipped into her room without a word, her mind racing with memories of Mary's advice and the intoxicating freedom she had felt, however briefly. Susan lingered in the living room, her gaze distant as she replayed the night's events. Jake and Cruz, both weary and conflicted, retreated to their respective spaces, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them. The night had pushed them closer to the edge, and as they each lay awake in the darkness, they couldn't escape the feeling that their lives were about to change forever. Chapter 10, Unspoken Truths. The morning after the wild party had left the air thick with unspoken words, the two couples found themselves retreating to separate activities to clear their minds. Bayor, Cruz, and Jake decided to indulge in a round of golf at a nearby exclusive course, while Mary, Susan, and Victoria chose to unwind at a luxurious spa. The hope was that some time apart would help them regain composure after the revelry of the previous night. But each of them carried the weight of the night before, the things they had seen, heard, and perhaps even felt. The golf outing, a lesson in life. The sprawling golf course was pristine, with rolling hills, manicured greens, and sweeping views of the ocean beyond. As Bayor, Cruz, and Jake teed off, the morning air was fresh, and the steady rhythm of their swings gave the illusion of normalcy. The three men exchanged competitive banter as they navigated the course, but beneath the casual conversation was a simmering undercurrent of tension. Bayor, ever the instigator, led the group with confidence, his stride easy and relaxed as he drove the ball down the fairway. His laughter echoed across the course, a stark contrast to the more subdued moods of Cruz and Jake. They both noticed how easily Bayor shifted between playful charm and serious businessman, a man who had mastered the art of balance in his life, a life that, from the outside, seemed perfect. You know, Bayor said casually as they walked between holes, I'm starting to think you two are taking this whole thing too seriously. He glanced over at Cruz and Jake, their faces still tight with tension. You've got to loosen up. Life's too short, especially when you've got everything we've got. Cruz gave a strained smile, the strain in his voice evident. I think we all have our way of handling things. Bayor raised an eyebrow, stopping for a moment to adjust his glove. I get it. You're both married to beautiful women, and you want to make sure you're the only ones they look at. But what if you're overthinking it? I'm telling you, the secret is in having fun together. A little freedom, a little risk, it keeps the fire alive. Jake scoffed lightly but didn't completely dismiss the idea. So, what? You think swinging is the answer? Bayor chuckled, taking a swig from his water bottle. I don't just think it's the answer, Jake. I know it is. My wife and I, we've been through it all. The highs, the lows, the good, the bad. But what's kept us together all these years is that we never stopped having fun. We don't get bogged down by the rules of what people think marriage should look like. Cruz shot him a sidelong glance. You're saying you don't mind sharing your wife with other men? Bayor didn't flinch. Not at all. It's not about ownership, Cruz. It's about trust. It's about having an understanding that what we do together, with others, doesn't change what we have at home. There's a difference between love and possession. Jake stayed quiet for a moment, absorbing Bayor's words. He had always admired Bayor's confidence, but now it felt like a veil had been lifted, revealing a more radical view of relationships. The idea of freedom, of not being confined by traditional norms, was enticing and terrifying all at once. The spa day, a conversation between women at the same time, the women found themselves stepping into an entirely different world. The spa was an oasis of calm, with softly lit rooms, the delicate scent of essential oils filling the air, and the soothing sound of water trickling in the background. Victoria, Susan, and Mary were escorted to a private treatment room where they could indulge in massages, facials, and other treatments designed to relax the body and mind. As the therapists worked their magic, the conversation turned to more personal matters, with Mary at the center of the discussion. Her carefree nature, which had been so magnetic at the party, now revealed itself to be the product of a philosophy she had lived by for years. She spoke openly, perhaps too openly, about the dynamics of her marriage to Bayor, details that surprised Susan and Victoria, though neither of them had the courage to interrupt her. Bayor and I, we have a very unique arrangement, Mary began, her voice warm and inviting. We're not like most couples. We never try to control each other. We're not jealous of the people we sleep with because we know we belong to each other in a way that's deeper than that. Susan shifted uncomfortably in her seat, unsure of where the conversation was going. She glanced at Victoria, who seemed equally apprehensive, but the two women remained silent, listening intently. You see, Mary continued, her hands resting behind her head as she reclined, Bayor and I never wanted our marriage to become boring. It's so easy for things to fall into a routine, and before you know it, you're just roommates instead of lovers. So we decided to keep things exciting. We swing with other couples sometimes, it's just a part of what keeps us, well, alive. Keeps the passion burning. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, a flush creeping up her neck. She had heard of couples experimenting with open relationships, but hearing it from Mary made it feel too real, too tangible. I know it's not for everyone, Mary added, as though reading their minds. But Bayor and I have been together for a long time. We've done the traditional thing, and we've done the unconventional. The key is that we're on the same page. We trust each other, and that trust allows us to have fun, to explore, and to not worry about what society thinks. Susan, ever the curious one, asked hesitantly, but doesn't that make things complicated? What if you get too attached to someone else? Mary's smile was gentle, almost reassuring. It doesn't. Because it's not about the other people. It's about us. We do it for the connection, the thrill, the excitement. It's something we share together. And it's made us stronger. We've never been more in love with each other. Our marriage is built on having fun, and that's something we'll never lose. A new perspective back on the golf course, Bayor was getting ready to putt when Cruz spoke up, the words heavy with thought. So, you really think swinging keeps things together? That it makes a marriage stronger? Bayor didn't immediately answer, focusing on his next shot. When he did look up, there was a gleam in his eye, a mixture of pride and experience. I do. You're free to do what you want, Cruz. But my advice? Let go of the control. Don't hold on too tightly to what you think your relationship should be. Love isn't about possession, it's about freedom. Freedom to enjoy life, to explore, and to trust each other. Cruz was quiet, digesting the words. For all his wealth and success, he had never truly considered relationships in such a light. He had always believed in loyalty, in the sanctity of marriage, but Bayor's words opened a door to something new, something dangerous yet thrilling. As the day wore on, both Cruz and Jake found themselves contemplating what they had just learned about Bayor's unconventional marriage, about the freedom of letting go, and about the temptation to test the boundaries of their own relationships. The temptation of the night the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving a velvety twilight in its wake. The four friends Cruz, Victoria, Jake, and Susan had returned to their villa after their respective outings, each of them still processing the day's revelations. Despite the tension that lingered between them, they had agreed to meet up again, as if subconsciously seeking to continue what had begun the night before, exploring the new boundaries that had been revealed but not yet fully explored. Bayor and Mary had suggested something bold to cap off their day, a visit to a high-end, exclusive strip club located just outside the resort. The establishment promised not only erotic entertainment but also a space where they could indulge in more than just the usual spectacle. It was a place where boundaries could be pushed, where inhibition could be shed, and where they could all let loose in ways they hadn't yet done. The idea was both tantalizing and terrifying. But after everything that had happened, they felt strangely compelled to follow the lead of Bayor and Mary, drawn by their free-spirited attitude and their confidence in challenging the norms. The strip club, a night of freedom. The strip club was hidden behind tall iron gates, its exterior unassuming, but as soon as the doors opened, it revealed an atmosphere of lavish decadence. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and cigars, the low hum of upbeat music reverberating off the walls. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows across the room where scantily clad women danced on stage, their bodies moving with sensual precision. The atmosphere was both intimate and provocative, each private booth offering seclusion for those who desired it. Bayor led the way, his demeanor effortlessly charming as he greeted the staff and guided the group through the velvet-lined halls. "Trust me, you're going to love this place," he said with a grin. "It's not just about the striptease. There's a certain magic here, a freedom you won't find anywhere else." Victoria felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity bubbling inside her, unsure of what to expect. Susan, on the other hand, was already captivated by the environment, her eyes wide with excitement. Cruz and Jake shared a quiet glance, each of them wondering what exactly they had gotten themselves into. They were led to a private booth in the back, a secluded area with plush seats and a small table set up with drinks. The moment they sat down, a waiter brought over a bottle of top-shelf vodka and began mixing drinks. As the liquor began to flow, the group loosened up, their inhibitions slowly fading away. Conversations started to flow more freely as laughter echoed around the booth, and the sight of the dancers, their movements fluid and hypnotic, seemed to hold everyone's attention. Playing games, a delicate line. The night took a turn when Bayor proposed a game. It wasn't a typical game of cards or dice, instead, it was a more daring proposition. "Let's see who can hold their composure the longest," he suggested, a playful gleam in his eyes. "We'll each take turns making a choice, and the others have to follow through. It's about pushing each other's comfort zones, but without crossing the line." Cruz and Jake exchanged skeptical looks. Victoria hesitated, a subtle flush creeping across her face. Susan, however, was eager to participate, her competitive nature igniting. The first round was innocent enough. Bayor picked a dancer and invited her over to their booth. She was confident and elegant, an intoxicating mix of allure and charm. She performed a slow, sensual lap dance for Jake, who, to his credit, managed to keep his composure, though his hands twitched as though wanting to touch. Cruz found his eyes glued to the scene, but he didn't look away, trying to maintain a sense of control, of not giving in to the desire bubbling inside him. Next, the game took a more provocative turn. Mary, with a playful wink, chose a daring suggestion for Victoria, who, despite her initial hesitation, found herself laughing and going along with the challenge. It was a simple dare to allow one of the dancers to come closer and dance for her. The act, innocent as it seemed, sent a ripple of tension through the group, and the alcohol only fueled the fire. As the night wore on, the games became more sexual in nature, pushing each couple further into a gray area they hadn't yet explored. Intoxication and boundaries, the thin line. The drinks flowed freely, and with each round of liquor, the lines between excitement and indulgence blurred. Cruz found himself drawn to one of the dancers who seemed to notice his gaze, making her way over to him with a confidence that matched his own. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she was savoring every second of their interaction. His heart pounded in his chest, the proximity to the woman, the shared energy, intoxicating him. But even as he responded to her touch, Cruz's mind raced. What was happening to him? Why did this feel so right? His thoughts were fragmented, the presence of his wife and his best friend barely registering as he lost himself in the moment. Jake, too, was starting to unravel. He had always been the more reserved of the two men, but the atmosphere in the club had a way of drawing out a side of him he wasn't fully prepared to confront. His eyes were drawn to Susan, who was now laughing flirtatiously at something one of the dancers had said. There was something about the way Susan was letting go, embracing the freedom, that captivated him. And as the alcohol coursed through his veins, the barriers he had erected between himself and temptation seemed to crumble. Meanwhile, Susan was fully in the moment, her inhibitions shattered. The alcohol, combined with the sexual energy that hung in the air, made her feel both liberated and powerful. She was laughing and joking with the dancers, enjoying the attention, savoring the feel of the touch of strangers who didn't know her as anyone other than a woman of allure. There was something thrilling about being desired, about being the center of attention, even if just for a fleeting moment. Victoria, on the other hand, felt like a spectator in her own life. She had always prided herself on being composed, careful with her emotions and her choices. Yet, as she watched Susan laughing and Cruz and Jake lost in their own flirtations, a curiosity stirred within her. What would it feel like to completely surrender, to give in to the temptation without reservation? The question lingered in the back of her mind as she watched Bayor and Mary whispering to each other, exchanging secrets and knowing glances. A conversation of secrets. As the night stretched on, Bayor and Mary took a moment to step away from the group. They wandered toward the quieter side of the club, near a private VIP area, and sat together at a small table, enjoying a moment of relative solitude amidst the chaos of the evening. "I know they're all thinking about it," Mary said with a knowing smile, her eyes scanning the room. "The idea of freedom. The idea of living outside the box. It's powerful, isn't it?" Bayor chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "It is. But that's what keeps things interesting. It's not about the sex, Mary. It's about the experience, the feeling of being alive, unencumbered by the usual rules. Mary raised her eyebrows. You know, we've made love in some pretty strange places. She leaned in closer, her voice lowering to a teasing whisper. I've had sex on the roof of a hotel, in the back of a limo, even in the woods during a storm. There's something about the risk, about doing something outrageous, that makes it feel so much more intense. Bayor's grin widened. I know exactly what you mean. It's about breaking free of the expectations, about pushing past the lines everyone else draws. He paused, eyes glinting with mischief. And I think they'll get there. Maybe not tonight, but soon. They'll realize that it's not about the judgment, it's about being real with each other. As they exchanged these whispered secrets, back at the booth, the group was slowly losing themselves to the intoxicating mix of alcohol, lust, and temptation. Boundaries were tested, but the real questions, the deeper issues, lingered just beneath the surface. The night was far from over. But when morning came, they would all have to face the consequences of the choices they had made. This chapter continues to push the characters further into a complex exploration of their desires, boundaries, and the intoxicating nature of freedom. It shows how alcohol, temptation, and the influence of Bayor and Mary lead to a blur of actions and emotions, setting up a larger conflict that will unfold as the story progresses. Chapter 11, Unspoken Desires. The next morning came slowly, with the sun rising in a hazy blur over the resort. The wild, indulgent night left traces in the air, a palpable tension between the four friends, even as they attempted to return to some semblance of normalcy. They met up for breakfast, but the usual chatter was replaced by awkward glances and strained smiles. The events of the previous night had opened a door they weren't sure they wanted to walk through, but now, they were standing on the precipice, uncertain whether to move forward or retreat. After breakfast, the group decided to spend the rest of the day by the pool, a perfect way to unwind and recover from the late-night revelry. The heat of the afternoon sun wrapped around them as they made their way to the poolside area, the sound of water splashing and soft music filling the air. The resort's pool was an oasis, surrounded by palm trees and plush lounge chairs, offering both seclusion and luxury. It was the perfect place to escape the noise of the world and lose themselves in the warmth of the day. Bayor and Mary, as usual, led the way, effortlessly claiming the best spot by the water. They were relaxed, almost as if nothing had changed. Mary stretched out on the lounge chair, her sunglasses perched on her nose, while Bayor lounged next to her, his arm casually draped across her shoulder. The two of them appeared to be in their element, a perfect image of carefree indulgence. Cruz, Victoria, Jake, and Susan followed them to their spots, each of them quietly settling into their own spaces, trying to shake off the unease of the previous night. The poolside, a day of unspoken words. The pool was a tranquil haven, its water glimmering in the sunlight, the scent of sunscreen mixing with the tropical air. The warm breeze stirred the palm trees, their fronds rustling softly. Cruz lay back on his lounge chair, his arms folded behind his head as he stared up at the clear blue sky. His mind was racing, but he tried to focus on the simple pleasure of being outside, of allowing his body to relax after the tensions of the past few days. Next to him, Victoria sat with a book in hand, her gaze flicking over the pages, though her thoughts seemed to be elsewhere. She had always been the more reserved one in their relationship, a quiet observer of the world around her. But now, with the events of the past few days weighing on her, she felt as though she were caught between two worlds, the one she knew, and the one that was pulling her deeper into uncharted waters. Jake, on the other hand, had taken to the pool itself, swimming laps in an attempt to clear his mind. The cool water felt refreshing against his skin, the rhythmic strokes of his arms providing a temporary escape from the turmoil he couldn't shake. He didn't know where to place the feelings that had been stirred within him the night before. The idea of swinging, of exploring new forms of intimacy, had become an obsession, a temptation that he wasn't sure he could ignore. Susan, sitting by the pool's edge, dipped her feet into the water, letting the coolness soothe her. She watched Jake with a quiet intensity, her thoughts a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. The night before had awakened something in her, a desire to explore and to push boundaries, but now, in the quiet of the afternoon, those feelings seemed distant, almost like a dream. Still, she couldn't help but glance over at Jake from time to time, wondering what had changed between them, if anything at all. A hidden kiss, the spark of desire. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere around the pool became more relaxed, but the tension between Cruz and Susan continued to simmer beneath the surface. They had always been close, their friendship formed years ago, long before their respective marriages, but there was something different now. Their shared history was suddenly laced with an unspoken attraction that neither had fully acknowledged, but both could feel. Cruz had noticed it too. The way Susan's laughter seemed to linger in his mind, the way her touch had felt just a little too electric the night before. It wasn't something he had planned or expected, it was a spark that had been kindled without warning, and now, it was burning in the background of every interaction. He found himself stealing glances at her more often, his thoughts drifting to her in a way that made him feel both guilty and intrigued. At one point, as the others were lounging around or swimming, Cruz found himself alone by the edge of the pool, leaning against a stone pillar that separated the pool area from the private gardens. He had gone for a brief swim to clear his head, but the water had done little to quiet his thoughts. He needed a moment, away from the group, away from the chaos of the past days. Just as he was about to walk back to his chair, he noticed Susan slipping away from the others, her eyes scanning the area as she moved toward the secluded corner of the garden. The quiet hush of the resort's grounds, combined with the soft rustling of the leaves, seemed to pull her in, as though the privacy of the space offered her a moment of escape. Cruz hesitated for only a second before following her, his footsteps soft on the stone path. When he reached her, she was standing near a small fountain, the water trickling peacefully in the background. She didn't hear him approach, and for a brief moment, he simply watched her. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and her expression was distant, as though she were lost in thought. Cruz didn't know what possessed him, but the urge to be near her, to reach out and close the distance between them, was undeniable. "Susan," he called softly. She turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise, as though she hadn't expected anyone to find her. But there was something else in her gaze, something that spoke of anticipation. Her lips parted as if to speak, but before she could say anything, Cruz stepped forward. Without thinking, he reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing over her skin in a tender, almost reverent gesture. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, their breaths shallow, their gazes locked. The world seemed to fall away as they stood in that small, private space, the only sounds the distant laughter from the pool and the soft whisper of the breeze through the trees. Then, without any more hesitation, Cruz leaned in. His lips met hers in a kiss that was tentative at first, as though they were testing the waters. But once the initial shock wore off, the kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more hungry. The spark between them, that hidden attraction, flared into something more tangible, more real. Cruz felt a jolt of electricity shoot through his body, and he pulled her closer, as though he couldn't get enough of the sensation. Susan responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck as she pressed herself against him. The kiss was everything: passion, longing, and the heady thrill of something forbidden. It felt both dangerous and exhilarating, a moment of pure indulgence in a place where no one could see them. After the kiss, guilt and desire. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathing heavily, their hearts pounding in their chests. They stared at each other, wide-eyed, as though unsure of what had just transpired. I shouldn't have done that," Cruz whispered, his voice thick with regret. Susan looked away, her cheeks flushed. "Neither should I," she replied softly, but her voice betrayed a hint of something else, something deeper, more conflicted. They stood there for a moment in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily between them. But despite the guilt that crept in, neither of them could deny the intensity of the moment, the undeniable connection they had shared. Finally, Cruz took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "We can't tell anyone about this," he said, his voice firm. Susan nodded, her eyes still focused on the ground. "No, we can't." And with that, they left the secluded spot, returning to the poolside, as if nothing had happened. But both of them knew that things had changed, that something had shifted between them, something that neither could ignore. As they rejoined the others, the tension between them lingered, unspoken but present. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, the laughter around the pool and the conversations all seeming distant, as Cruz and Susan silently carried the weight of their stolen kiss, wondering what it meant for the days to come. Chapter 12, Unraveling Thoughts and Unspoken Desires. The soft hum of the air conditioning in the luxurious resort room was the only sound that accompanied Cruz's thoughts as he lay in bed, still trying to make sense of the previous night. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, but he wasn't truly seeing it. His mind kept returning to the kiss, how it had felt, the unexpected warmth of Susan's lips, the brief but powerful spark of something forbidden. Every time he tried to push it away, it crept back into his consciousness like an unwelcome guest. Cruz's body still hummed with the electricity of that moment, the touch of Susan's skin against his, the pulse of desire that had rushed through him. The kiss had been impulsive, something that neither of them had planned, but the intensity of it left him questioning everything. What did it mean? Why had he done it? And, most importantly, what would happen now? He turned his head slowly toward the empty side of the bed. Victoria, his wife of over a decade, was still sound asleep, her soft breathing a stark contrast to the turmoil inside Cruz. He hated the feeling of guilt gnawing at him, but there was no denying it. It was there, thick in his chest. As he lay there, the quiet ticking of the clock seemed to amplify his thoughts, each one pulling him further into the spiraling abyss of what had happened. Would Victoria ever know? Could he even admit it to himself, let alone to her? The sound of the bathroom door creaking open broke his reverie. Victoria stepped out, her face still soft from sleep, her golden hair tousled in a way that made her look even more beautiful. She smiled at him, but there was something in her eyes that told Cruz she could sense something was off. "Morning," she said softly, walking over to the side of the bed. She leaned down to kiss him on the cheek. "I'm meeting Susan and Mary for breakfast this morning. We're going to an antique store afterward. You're welcome to join us, but I thought you might want some time to yourself." Cruz smiled faintly, his mind still elsewhere. "Sounds nice," he said, though the words felt empty coming out of his mouth. "You all enjoy yourselves." Victoria didn't seem to notice the lack of enthusiasm in his voice, or maybe she didn't want to. She took a deep breath, brushing a few strands of hair behind her ear. "I'll see you later, okay?" "Yeah." "Later," Cruz muttered, though his mind was already miles away. Victoria gave him one last, lingering look before she turned and left the room, the sound of her footsteps fading as she headed toward the rest of the group. Cruz was alone again, left with the weight of his thoughts, but this time there was a sharp edge to his guilt, a sense of isolation that had never been there before. The breakfast table, Mary's bold confession. It wasn't long before the morning sun began to climb higher, filling the resort with warmth and light. Cruz eventually dragged himself out of bed, though he wasn't in a hurry. He knew he had a Zoom meeting scheduled in the next hour, but his mind was still preoccupied with everything that had happened. He tried to focus on work, but the nagging feeling of having crossed a line lingered. As he made his way to the breakfast area, he found the girls already seated, chatting animatedly. The table was filled with a spread of fresh pastries, exotic fruits, and hot coffee. Mary, as usual, was the most outspoken of the group, her laughter filling the air as she regaled Susan and Victoria with some wild story. Cruz couldn't help but overhear her bold and unfiltered voice as he approached. "And I'm telling you, you've got to experience it for yourself," Mary was saying, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "The masked naked parties at this resort? They're unbelievable. They happen almost every night. Everyone's wearing masks, so there's no judgment, no boundaries. It's just about letting go and having fun. Some people go all out with costumes, some keep it simple, but I've never had more fun in my life. Victoria blinked, a bit taken aback. Masked naked parties, she repeated, sounding incredulous but also curious. Oh, absolutely, Mary said with a loud laugh. They're the highlight of the resort. A real liberating experience. You'd be surprised at how many couples are into it. It's all about letting go of your inhibitions. No one knows who you are, just a night of freedom and fun. Susan chuckled nervously, unsure how to respond. I don't know, Mary, that sounds a little too wild for me. Oh, trust me, Mary insisted, leaning in closer to Victoria and Susan. You don't know what you're missing. People come here just for those parties. You'd be amazed at how much you can enjoy when you take off the mask, literally and figuratively. It's like a whole other world. You'd fit right in. Victoria looked unsure, but there was something in Mary's enthusiasm that made it hard to dismiss completely. Maybe, she said hesitantly, but I'm not sure it's my scene. Mary's laugh rang out again, loud and carefree. You're saying that now, but trust me, by the end of the week, you'll be the first one at the door. Cruz, sitting down at the table with a cup of coffee, tried to ignore the direction the conversation was going. Mary's words lingered in the air, and despite himself, he felt a rush of intrigue. There was something liberating about the idea, something dangerous, but that was exactly what had drawn him to the kiss with Susan in the first place. The thrill of the forbidden. The edge of temptation. Fishing with Bayor, the unspoken truths. Later that day, Cruz found himself in a Zoom meeting, trying his best to focus on the work at hand. But as he listened to the conference call, his thoughts kept wandering back to the conversation with Mary, and his feelings about Susan. His body ached with the weight of guilt, but he couldn't escape the undeniable desire that had ignited between him and his best friend's wife. Meanwhile, Jake and Bayor had gone fishing at the nearby lake, a tranquil spot at the resort where the water was still and the trees around the perimeter provided welcome shade. Bayor had always been the more laid-back of the two, with a devil-may-care attitude that seemed to rub off on everyone around him. Jake, on the other hand, was the quieter one, more reserved, though he had grown increasingly aware of the subtle shift in the atmosphere between the two couples. He had noticed the way Cruz had been acting, the tension in the air, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. As they sat by the lake, Bayor threw his fishing line into the water, then glanced sideways at Jake with a sly grin. So, Jake, he said casually, I've been thinking. You've been spending a lot of time with Cruz lately. He's a good guy, but there's something I've noticed. Jake raised an eyebrow, trying to hide his discomfort. What do you mean? Bayor's grin widened. Come on, man. Don't try to deny it. You've got a bit of a thing for Victoria, don't you? Jake froze, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. He tried to shrug it off, to laugh it off, but there was something in Bayor's eyes that made him uneasy. What are you talking about? Jake said, trying to sound nonchalant. Oh, don't play coy, Bayor chuckled. I can see it. You've been looking at her differently, haven't you? I can't blame you. She's gorgeous. I don't blame anyone who's caught her eye. Jake tried to keep his voice steady. You're out of your mind, Bayor. She's married to Cruz. Bayor waved a dismissive hand. That's just a technicality, my friend. I'm just saying, it happens. I should know. I stole Mary from my younger brother. You'd be surprised at what a little charm and a bit of patience can do. Jake stared at him, momentarily stunned. You're serious? You really stole her from your brother? Bayor laughed loudly, throwing his head back. Oh, it wasn't like that. But I'm just saying, if you've got your eye on someone, and the timing's right, well, things happen. Jake couldn't quite process the implications of what Bayor was saying. It was too casual, too flippant, and yet the words carried an unsettling weight. The temptation he'd felt for Victoria was real, he couldn't deny that, but he wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. He wasn't like Bayor, who seemed to live without rules, without restraint. As the two men sat in silence, waiting for a bite, Cruz's mind was far away in that Zoom meeting, but his thoughts were consumed by the same questions. The line between friendship and desire had blurred, and there was no going back. The game had changed and none of them were prepared for where it would lead. Chapter 13, The shift in the air. The days had started to blur together at Temptation's resort, each one filled with distractions, subtle games of flirtation, and stolen glances. For Cruz, the feeling of guilt never fully dissipated, but it also didn't stop him from seeking more. The kiss with Susan had triggered something within him, something deep and insistent, and despite all the confusion it had caused, he couldn't help but feel drawn to her in ways he hadn't expected. It was as if something was awakening inside him, and no matter how much he tried to bury it, the temptation was always there. It had been 3 days since the kiss, and Cruz found himself struggling with the tension between his emotions and his loyalty to Victoria. There were moments when he could look at her and see nothing but the woman he had married, the one he had promised to love forever. But then, just as quickly, memories of Susan's lips on his flooded his mind, and the line between right and wrong grew increasingly blurry. That morning, Cruz woke up early, as he had been doing for the past few days, staring at the ceiling with thoughts swirling like a storm in his mind. He hadn't shared his inner turmoil with anyone, least of all Victoria, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it hidden. Victoria, on the other hand, was oblivious to his inner conflict. She had been busy with her friends Susan and Mary and had begun to immerse herself in the activities the resort had to offer. Whether it was yoga, exploring antique stores, or enjoying lavish spa treatments, she seemed happy and carefree. It was clear that she was enjoying herself, but Cruz couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that something had shifted in their dynamic since arriving at the resort. The morning after that morning, after breakfast, Victoria was ready to head out with Susan and Mary for their daily exploration. Cruz had barely touched his coffee as he watched the 3 women prepare to leave for the antique shop. Their laughter echoed through the suite as they got ready, chatting about what treasures they might find. Susan seemed particularly animated, always at the center of the conversation, while Mary added her own brand of mischief to the mix. Victoria, dressed casually yet elegantly, was excited for a day out with her friends. "I'll be back before dinner," Victoria called over her shoulder as she gathered her bag. "We'll check out the antique store and maybe grab lunch by the beach." Cruz nodded absent-mindedly, offering her a forced smile. "Sounds good." But inside, his mind was far from the day's plans. As the women left, Cruz found himself pacing around the suite, feeling restless. He didn't have much on his plate today except another series of Zoom meetings, but it wasn't the work that kept him preoccupied. It was the unresolved tension between him and Susan. And more importantly, the simmering attraction he couldn't ignore. He knew that something needed to change, either he had to confront the feelings or put them to rest for good. But the latter seemed impossible now. He sat down by the window, staring out at the expansive view of the resort. The sun glinted off the shimmering pool below, and the waves of the nearby ocean seemed calm, almost inviting. But for Cruz, the serenity outside only deepened his inner unrest. He picked up his phone and scrolled through emails, but it was no use. Every time he looked at his screen, his mind kept drifting back to the night of the kiss with Susan. The lake and the tension between friends. Meanwhile, Jake and Bayor had gone fishing again that afternoon. The quiet lake, surrounded by dense trees, provided the perfect backdrop for a much-needed escape from the chaos of resort life. Bayor, ever the talkative one, cast his line into the water with a practiced flick and settled into the reclining chair beside Jake. "So, what's really going on between you and Cruz?" Bayor asked, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. Jake glanced at him, surprised by the directness of the question. He knew that Bayor was always observant, but it still took him off guard. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Bayor's eyes twinkled with mischief. "I mean, you've been acting a little different around Cruz lately. You two have always been close, but there's something about you now. It's like there's a secret, or maybe more like an unspoken tension." Jake felt his chest tighten. He hadn't realized it was that obvious. It wasn't just the awkwardness he felt around Cruz, either. There were moments when the attraction to Victoria, his best friend's wife, became too overwhelming to ignore. He wasn't proud of it, but it was true. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said, trying to cover his unease with a laugh. "Cruz and I are fine." Bayor, however, wasn't buying it. He sat back and gave Jake a knowing smile. "Come on, don't play the innocent card with me. You've been looking at Victoria differently, haven't you?" Jake stiffened, feeling a rush of heat rise to his face. He didn't know how to respond, so he avoided the question by focusing on the water. "You're wrong," he muttered, trying to sound dismissive. Bayor didn't let up. "Oh, I'm not wrong. I've been around. You know, I'm not the only one who notices things, right? Cruz does too." Jake's stomach lurched at the thought of Cruz finding out. He wasn't sure if it would make things more complicated or just destroy their friendship altogether. But deep down, he knew Bayor was right. There was an undeniable chemistry between him and Victoria, one that neither of them had acted on yet. Bayor let out a low chuckle. "I know what it's like. I've been there. But listen, you've got to be careful with these kinds of things. You don't want to end up crossing lines you can't uncross." Jake nodded, but his mind was racing. What was he supposed to do? The idea of losing his friendship with Cruz over something so dangerous seemed impossible to reconcile. But at the same time, he couldn't stop himself from feeling drawn to Victoria in ways he hadn't anticipated. The unspoken attraction back at the resort, Cruz finally pulled himself together enough to join his Zoom meeting. But it wasn't long before his thoughts began to wander once again. The more he tried to focus on the business at hand, the more the image of Susan's smile and her lips kept intruding on his thoughts. The idea of taking things further with her terrified him, but the temptation was undeniable. As the meeting concluded, Cruz leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. He needed a break, something to clear his mind. The stress from the morning, the underlying tension, and the images of Susan all piled up on him. He stood up, walked to the balcony, and took a deep breath. The air felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of the choices he was avoiding. Somewhere deep down, Cruz knew he had reached a breaking point. The tension between him and Susan, his unspoken feelings, and the growing divide between him and Victoria were all building toward something irreversible. Whether he was ready to face it or not, the choices he made in the next few days would have far-reaching consequences. For now, though, Cruz let himself breathe in the air, trying to stave off the impending storm that was about to hit. He couldn't stop thinking about how everything was about to change. Chapter 14, Crossing Lines. The days at Temptations Resort had started to feel like a blur of mixed emotions, desires, and hidden truths. Cruz couldn't seem to shake the feeling that the moment he had shared with Susan the kiss that had haunted him was merely the tip of the iceberg. The magnetic pull he felt toward her was undeniable, but so was the deep loyalty he had for his wife, Victoria. It was like walking on a tightrope, with each step growing more precarious. And yet, it seemed as though everyone around him was pushing him toward the edge, in one way or another. That afternoon, as Cruz sat by the poolside, he tried his best to relax. The warm sun kissed his skin, but the cool breeze from the ocean did little to ease his inner turmoil. His mind was a storm, racing with thoughts of what had already happened, and what could still happen. He tried to focus on the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, but all he could think about was Susan, and how much he had wanted her in ways he had never wanted anyone else before. Victoria was off with Susan and Mary, exploring a local market, and Cruz took the rare moment of solitude to reflect. He couldn't avoid the fact that something between him and Susan had changed, irrevocably. The kiss had been an impulse, something that had ignited without warning. But now, he knew, there was no going back. The attraction was there, undeniable, simmering beneath the surface. Even though they hadn't spoken of it since, the tension was thick in the air whenever they were together. Susan's challenge. Later that afternoon, Cruz received a text message from Susan, a simple one-line inquiry, "Do you think we can talk?" His heart skipped a beat, and despite his better judgment, he found himself immediately typing a response, "Where?" The thought of meeting her alone made his stomach twist, but it was a feeling he had come to expect. He knew there was no stopping what had already started. They agreed to meet at a quiet spot by the resort's private beach, away from the prying eyes of other guests. As Cruz made his way down the winding path toward the water, he could already feel the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew that whatever happened next would change everything. When he arrived, Susan was already there, standing near the water's edge. She looked breathtaking, her hair blowing softly in the wind, her eyes reflecting the blue of the ocean. She wore a simple white sundress that hugged her figure perfectly, her beauty undeniable. And yet, as Cruz approached, he saw the uncertainty in her posture. She was just as conflicted as he was. "You came," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. There was a sense of relief in her tone, but also something darker, something that neither of them had addressed yet. "I'm here," Cruz replied, though his voice was rougher than he intended. He wasn't sure what else to say. He wanted to apologize for the kiss, wanted to take it back, but something inside him didn't want to let it go. Susan turned to face him, her eyes locking with his. "Cruz, I've been thinking about everything," she began, hesitating as if choosing her words carefully. "That kiss. I can't get it out of my head." "I'm sure you can't either." Cruz swallowed, the words choking in his throat. He nodded, unable to deny the truth. He couldn't stop thinking about it either. "I don't know what to say," he confessed, looking down at the sand beneath his feet. "It wasn't supposed to happen. It was wrong." Susan stepped closer to him, her gaze unwavering. "But it did happen. And we both felt it, didn't we? There's something between us, Cruz. I can feel it every time I look at you. Every time we're near each other. It's like a spark, and I don't know how to ignore it." Cruz's heart pounded in his chest, the temptation of her words pulling him in. He had never expected this, to be standing on the precipice of something so dangerous, so forbidden. But here he was, inches away from crossing a line he knew he shouldn't. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, almost to himself. "I don't want to hurt Victoria. I can't lose her. Not like this." Susan stepped even closer, her fingers brushing against his arm. Her touch was electric, and Cruz could feel the heat building between them. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Cruz. But I can't ignore what I feel. And I don't think you can either." Before he could respond, she reached up, cupping his face in her hands. Her lips were so close to his, her breath warm against his skin. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of them standing on the edge of something they both knew they shouldn't cross. Then, without a word, Susan kissed him again. This time, there was no hesitation. No second guessing. The kiss was deep, consuming, and full of all the desire they had both been trying to suppress. Cruz's hands went to her waist, pulling her closer as if he couldn't stop himself. Every nerve in his body was on fire, and as their kiss deepened, it was as if the world around them faded into oblivion. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless. Cruz's mind was a haze of emotions: desire, guilt, and confusion. He knew this couldn't continue. But for a brief moment, in that kiss, it felt as though nothing else mattered. "I can't do this," Cruz whispered, pulling away from her gently, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. I don't want to hurt Victoria. I can't betray her. Susan nodded, her eyes filled with an understanding sadness. I get it, she said softly, stepping back from him. But I don't know if I can stop either. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Cruz felt the pull of Susan's presence, the magnetic force that made it impossible to walk away, and yet, his loyalty to Victoria screamed at him to turn back. The line between right and wrong had blurred completely, and he wasn't sure how to fix it. Jake and Bayor, a different kind of conversation back at the lake. Jake and Bayor continued to fish, though the conversation had taken a different turn. Bayor, ever the insightful observer, noticed the unease in Jake's demeanor. He wasn't the type to let things go easily, especially when he could see someone struggling. You've been quiet, Bayor said, his voice casual but knowing. Is everything okay? Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Bayor. He had always admired his friend's ability to read people, to know when something was wrong. I don't know, Jake admitted, casting his line into the water. There's been something off between me and Cruz lately. Bayor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? Jake hesitated before speaking. It's Victoria. I think I have feelings for her. More than just friends. Bayor leaned back, his expression unreadable. That's a tough situation. Cruz is your best friend, and Victoria is, well, she's Victoria. But I've been there. Sometimes, things just happen, and you don't really have control over them. Jake looked at him, wide-eyed. What are you saying? Bayor chuckled, his eyes gleaming with a playful yet serious glint. I'm saying, sometimes the heart wants what it wants. But you've got to be careful. Don't let it ruin your friendships, man. If you're going to do something, you better be sure of it. Jake sat in silence, the weight of Bayor's words settling on him. He had known for a while that his feelings for Victoria had been growing, but hearing Bayor say it out loud made it all the more real. The temptation was there, but was it worth risking everything? As they fished in silence, Jake realized that the choices they all made in the coming days would shape everything: friendships, marriages, and maybe even their futures. There was no going back now. The calm before the storm. As Cruz stood on the beach, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him, he couldn't help but feel the storm brewing. The kiss with Susan had opened a door that could never be closed. The lines between right and wrong, friendship and betrayal, had all blurred. And as he walked back toward the resort, he knew that things were only going to get more complicated. He had crossed a line. Now, the question was, could he live with the consequences? Chapter 15, A Turning Point. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the resort's sprawling grounds. Cruz sat on the edge of the private terrace, his thoughts heavy with the events of the past few days. The kiss with Susan still lingered in his mind. Each time he thought about it, his pulse quickened. It was the line that had been crossed, a boundary between desire and guilt, and there was no easy way to walk it back. The temptation that had been growing inside him for days now seemed unstoppable, and the more he fought it, the more it seemed to consume him. Victoria was inside, preparing for the evening with Mary and Susan, getting ready to enjoy another night out at the resort. Cruz wasn't sure if he could bear to be around them tonight. His mind was too cluttered, his heart too conflicted. The man he used to be, the one who had pledged loyalty to his wife and his friends, felt like a stranger now. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the consequences of that were becoming more and more apparent with each passing hour. Susan's confession. That evening, after the dinner rush, Cruz received a message from Susan. The simple text was enough to make his heart race. We need to talk. Can you meet me at the usual spot? The words sent a shiver down his spine. He knew exactly where she meant, the secluded spot by the beach, where they had kissed just a few days before. The place where everything had changed. Cruz felt a deep pang of guilt at the thought of returning there, but he knew that he had no choice. The questions he had been avoiding were now coming to a head. He needed closure, whether it was to end things or to figure out what was happening between them. But deep down, he feared that this meeting would change everything even more than it already had. He left their suite quietly, the sounds of the evening laughter, the clinking of glasses, the hum of music fading behind him as he made his way to the beach. The warm, salty air rushed to meet him, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore seemed louder now than ever before. The beach was almost deserted at this hour, the sun having long since disappeared, leaving only the stars above and the moon to light his path. Susan was already there, waiting for him. She stood near the water's edge, her silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. As Cruz approached, she turned to face him, her expression soft but unreadable. "Cruz," she greeted him, her voice low and gentle, like the calm before a storm. "I'm glad you came." He didn't respond immediately, his chest tightening as he approached her. The tension between them was thick, the unspoken desire still lingering in the air. He could feel the pull of it, just like the first time they had kissed. But now, everything felt different. More complicated. Dangerous. Susan took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I need to be honest with you, Cruz. I've been thinking about our kiss. About everything that's been happening between us." She paused, searching his face for any sign of resistance, but finding none. "I don't want to feel like this. But I can't ignore it anymore. I can't stop thinking about you. I don't know if I should hate myself for it, or if I should just embrace it." Cruz felt his heart pound in his chest. It was exactly what he had feared, she was feeling the same pull, the same confusion. And as much as he wanted to pull away, as much as he knew that he shouldn't get any deeper into this, his body was betraying him. He could feel the heat between them, the attraction that was undeniable, and for a brief moment, he let himself forget about everything else. "I don't know what to do either," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried to fight it, but every time I look at you, I can't stop myself. I've never felt anything like this before." Susan's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his arm gently. "I'm not saying we should run away together, Cruz. I'm not saying we should do anything crazy. But I can't pretend like this isn't real. Can you?" Her words were a challenge, a dare, as if she was testing the limits of what they were willing to risk. Cruz closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words. He knew that if they took this any further, there would be no turning back. He would be betraying Victoria, the woman he had promised to love and cherish. But the attraction to Susan was too strong to ignore, and in that moment, his desire for her overwhelmed everything else. "I don't know," Cruz said hoarsely, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could say that I can walk away from this, that it's not worth risking everything. But the truth is, I don't know how to stop it." Susan took another step closer, her breath mingling with his. For a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching out between them like an unspoken promise. And then, without a word, she kissed him again. This time, there was no hesitation. No guilt. Just the overwhelming desire to feel each other, to taste each other, to give in to the temptation that had been building for days. Cruz's arms wrapped around her instinctively, pulling her closer as they kissed with an intensity that left no room for doubt. The world around them ceased to exist, there was only the heat between them, the fire that had been ignited by one simple kiss. Victoria's unseen strain back at the resort. Victoria was oblivious to the storm that was brewing just outside the walls of their shared life. She had spent the evening with Mary and Susan, laughing and shopping, enjoying the carefree moments that she had come to cherish. But even as she smiled and joked with her friends, there was an undercurrent of unease growing inside her. She couldn't quite place it, but she knew something was different. She couldn't put her finger on it, but every time Cruz's name came up, her stomach churned with a sense of doubt. It was as if he had become a stranger to her in recent days. The playful intimacy they had once shared now felt distant, replaced with long silences and moments where Cruz seemed to retreat into his own thoughts. She told herself that it was just the pressures of their lives outside the resort, the business, the distractions, but deep down, she knew it was something more. Tonight, as she lay in their suite, trying to focus on a book she had brought along, her thoughts kept drifting to Cruz. Why had he been acting so distant? Why had the connection between them felt like it was fading? Victoria had no idea that just a few hundred yards away, Cruz was standing on the edge of another line, one that would forever change their relationship. The breaking point as Cruz and Susan pulled apart, their breaths ragged, the realization of what they had just done hit them both. For a brief moment, they just stood there, staring at each other in silence. The kiss had been everything and nothing, an act of desire that had erased everything else, but had also created a chasm between them that neither of them could fill. "We can't do this again," Cruz finally said, his voice strained. "I can't keep doing this to Victoria. To myself." Susan nodded, her face a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I know," she whispered. "But I can't help how I feel. And neither can you." With one last lingering look, Cruz turned away, walking back toward the resort with his heart heavy and his mind clouded. He knew that the damage had already been done, and that the choices they had made would have consequences far beyond anything they could have imagined. As he walked back, Cruz couldn't help but wonder, could he ever find his way back to the life he had before all of this? Or had he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? The choices ahead. As Cruz lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't help but feel that his life had reached a crossroads. The kiss with Susan had shattered everything he thought he knew about loyalty, desire, and love. The feelings that had bloomed between them were undeniable, but at what cost? And as he closed his eyes, knowing that the next morning would bring new challenges, he realized that there was no turning back. The choices ahead of him were clear: face the consequences of what had happened, or try to bury them and risk losing everything in the process. Chapter 16. The unraveling. The morning came like any other, but the air in the resort felt different. The tension that had been building between Cruz and Susan had now spilled over, leaving everything feeling strained. Cruz lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, as if the answers to his questions were hidden in the cracks of the white plaster. The kiss they shared, the one that had ignited everything, was no longer a fleeting moment of passion. It had become something more, something dangerous, and Cruz knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. As he turned to look at Victoria, who was still asleep beside him, the weight of his actions hit him all over again. She looked peaceful, unaware of the emotional storm swirling inside him. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, a man who kept his promises. But now, in the wake of his actions, those promises felt like distant memories. The loyalty he had once felt so strongly toward Victoria was now being tested in ways he never could have imagined. The worst part? He wasn't sure how he felt anymore. A tense breakfast. When Victoria finally woke up, she smiled at Cruz, her eyes soft with affection, unaware of the inner turmoil that consumed him. "Good morning, darling," she said cheerfully, brushing her hair away from her face. Her warmth only made Cruz feel worse. He wanted to be the man she thought he was, the man she deserved. But every time he looked at her, his mind flashed to Susan and that kiss, and he felt a deep, gnawing guilt that wouldn't go away. Victoria leaned over to kiss him on the cheek. "What do you think about breakfast today? Susan and Mary are meeting us down by the resort's CAF. They want to show us some new items they found in the market yesterday." Cruz tried to force a smile, but it came off strained. "Sounds nice," he said, though his mind was a million miles away. As they made their way to the CAF, Cruz couldn't help but notice how Victoria had no idea about the storm raging inside him. She chatted happily with Mary, who was already at the table, while Cruz sat in silence, his thoughts elsewhere. The laughter and conversation around him felt distant, like he was watching everything through a foggy window. Susan wasn't there yet, but he knew she would be soon. He couldn't avoid her forever. When Susan finally walked in, her gaze met Cruz's across the table. The moment their eyes locked, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Neither of them could pretend that everything was fine. They were both aware of what had happened, and the weight of it hung between them like an invisible wall. Victoria, oblivious to the tension, smiled brightly at Susan. "Good morning. We were just talking about how much we enjoyed the shopping yesterday. It was so much fun, right?" Susan smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes, it was," she said, sitting down beside Mary. But Cruz could see the way her hand lingered near the edge of the table, her fingers twitching as if she was trying to reach out to him. Cruz tried to focus on the conversation, but the weight of Susan's presence beside him was too much. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was starting to unravel. The unexpected moment after breakfast, they all decided to take a walk along the beach, enjoying the beautiful weather. As they strolled along the shoreline, Cruz's mind kept drifting back to the previous night, the kiss, the promises made in the heat of passion. He was doing everything he could to keep his distance from Susan, but every glance, every passing moment, seemed to pull him back in. They stopped at a quiet spot near the water, where the others took off their shoes to dip their feet into the cool ocean. Cruz stood slightly apart, trying to keep his emotions in check, but it wasn't working. He felt Susan's eyes on him again, felt the pull that had been there ever since that first kiss. She was standing just a few feet away, her gaze never leaving his. He could feel the tension building, a dangerous energy crackling in the air between them. Victoria, sensing the tension but not understanding it, smiled at the others. "I'm going to sit over here for a moment. You guys catch up." She walked a little farther down the beach, leaving Cruz and Susan alone together for a moment. Susan took a step toward him, her voice low and almost pleading. "Cruz," she began, her tone soft but insistent. "We need to talk. You know we can't keep pretending like everything is okay, right?" Cruz's heart raced in his chest, but he fought to keep his composure. "We can't do this, Susan," he said, his voice strained. This thing between us, it's wrong. It's not fair to Victoria, and it's not fair to you." Susan's eyes flashed with something hurt, frustration, and perhaps a little anger. She stepped closer, lowering her voice even more. "I don't want to hurt anyone either, Cruz. But I can't ignore what we've shared. You feel it too. You know you do." Cruz opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, there was a rustling behind him. He turned to see Victoria, standing a few feet away, watching them both with a strange expression on her face. Her eyes flickered between Cruz and Susan, her gaze narrowing as if she were trying to understand something she couldn't quite place. Victoria's voice was cool, almost detached. "What's going on here?" Cruz's stomach dropped. He hadn't meant for this moment to happen, not like this. But there was no escaping the confrontation now. The confrontation. Susan stepped back slightly, looking at Victoria with an almost apologetic expression. "We were just talking," she said softly, though it was clear that there was much more beneath the surface. Victoria didn't respond to Susan's words. Instead, she turned her full attention to Cruz, her eyes searching his face for answers. "What were you talking about, Cruz?" she asked, her voice tight with something Cruz couldn't quite place: suspicion, hurt, confusion. "What's going on? Why do I feel like you're hiding something from me?" The air between them crackled with tension, and Cruz knew there was no turning back. He couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when everything was falling apart. His eyes shifted to Susan for a moment, then back to Victoria. I don't know how to explain this," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But there's something that's happened. Something I can't deny. I've been keeping it from you, and I should have told you sooner, but before he could finish, Victoria cut him off, her voice rising with emotion. "You've been hiding something from me? What do you mean? What is it, Cruz?" Because it sure as hell doesn't look like just a friendly conversation. The pain in her voice was clear, and it struck Cruz to his core. He had hurt her, and now there was no way to undo it. The truth was out, and there was no way to take it back. Susan stepped forward, sensing the escalating tension. Victoria, but Victoria held up her hand to silence her. No, Victoria said firmly. I don't want to hear it. I'm done. Cruz, I need to know what's going on. And I need you to be honest with me, for once. Cruz's heart sank. He had no words left. The truth was out, and now they were both standing on the edge of something that could never be undone. The foundation of his marriage had cracked, and there was no telling if it could ever be repaired. Victoria turned and walked away, her steps firm and determined. Cruz's heart broke as he watched her leave, but he knew that he had no one to blame but himself. As he turned to face Susan, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The woman he had loved for so long was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Cruz tried to reach Victoria, but she wouldn't take his calls, wouldn't respond to his messages. Susan had disappeared as well, likely to give him space, but he knew that the distance between them was no longer just physical. It was something deeper now, something that had irrevocably changed the dynamics of their relationships. That night, Cruz sat alone in his suite, staring at his phone, hoping for a message that would never come. The silence was deafening, and with each passing minute, it felt like his world was unraveling more and more. He had lost Victoria, the woman he had promised to spend his life with. And the temptation with Susan, the one that had seemed so irresistible, now felt like a hollow victory. There was no going back now. He had crossed the line. And everything that followed, every action, every word was just a consequence waiting to happen. Chapter 17, A Moment of Clarity. The morning was unusually quiet at the resort. The soft hum of the air conditioner was the only sound breaking the silence in Cruz's suite. He sat by the window, staring out at the view of the vast ocean that stretched to the horizon. The waves crashed against the shore in an endless rhythm, but inside Cruz, there was nothing but stillness. The emotional storm of the past few days had left him drained, as though every ounce of energy had been sucked out of him, leaving behind only a hollow shell. He had tried to sleep, to numb the overwhelming guilt and shame, but his mind had been racing all night. He couldn't escape the images of Victoria's face when she had walked away from him on the beach, her expression a mixture of hurt and betrayal that had cut deeper than he could have imagined. And Susan, her words, her touch, everything had felt so right in the moment, yet now felt like the worst kind of mistake. Cruz knew that he had failed both women in the worst way possible, and now there was no way to turn back. He had crossed a line, a boundary that once seemed unthinkable, and now he was left to deal with the consequences. Victoria's absence. It had been hours since Victoria had stormed off after the confrontation. Cruz hadn't heard a word from her since. His attempts to contact her were met with silence, no response to his calls, no replies to his texts. It was like she had disappeared into thin air. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. He had lost her. Cruz's thoughts began to spiral, each memory of their relationship playing like a film reel in his mind. The moments of laughter, the shared dreams, the promises they had made to each other when they first fell in love. How had it all gone so wrong? How had he allowed himself to be pulled into this web of temptation and deceit? His mind returned to the kiss with Susan, the way it had felt so natural, so intoxicating, like something he had been waiting for, even though he knew it was a mistake. He had never wanted to hurt Victoria. She had been his rock, his partner, his best friend. But now, everything was a tangled mess of guilt, desire, and regret. As the hours passed, Cruz couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every second that passed without hearing from Victoria was a second that took him further away from the life he had built with her. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he wasn't just losing her, he was losing himself. The man he had been, the man who had promised to protect her, to cherish her, was slipping away, replaced by someone who didn't even recognize himself anymore. Susan's struggle. Meanwhile, across the resort, Susan was fighting her own internal battle. The aftermath of their kiss still lingered in her mind, but it wasn't just the guilt that plagued her, it was the confusion. She had never intended for things to get so complicated. What had started as an innocent flirtation had escalated into something she had never imagined, and now, with Victoria in the picture, she found herself in an uncomfortable position. She sat on the balcony of her suite, her legs curled beneath her, staring out at the view. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water, but Susan couldn't bring herself to appreciate the beauty of the scene. Her mind kept replaying the kiss with Cruz, the intensity of it, the way it felt so right in the moment. But now, as she sat alone, she couldn't help but question what had happened. Was she just caught up in the heat of the moment, or was there something deeper at play? She had always been the free-spirited type, someone who reveled in the thrill of adventure and excitement. She had never been one for deep emotional connections, preferring to keep things light and fun. But Cruz had thrown her off balance. There was something about him that had drawn her in, something about the way he looked at her that made her feel seen, understood, even desirable in ways she hadn't expected. But now, she was standing at a crossroads. She had crossed a line, and she didn't know how to move forward. What did this mean for her marriage to Jake? For her friendship with Victoria? The last thing she wanted was to destroy someone else's happiness, especially not Victoria's, who was her dear friend. But at the same time, the connection she had shared with Cruz felt undeniable, something she couldn't ignore. As the sun dipped lower, Susan's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. She stood up and opened it to find Jake standing in the hallway, his face tight with concern. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "You okay?" Susan forced a smile, trying to push down the unease that had settled in her chest. "Yeah, just thinking about everything that's been happening." Jake stepped into the room, his eyes scanning her face for any signs of distress. He could sense that something was off, but he didn't know what. "You've been quiet since breakfast. Is everything all right?" Susan hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice barely a whisper. "Jake, I think I've made a mistake." He raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What kind of mistake?" Her gaze dropped to the floor as she struggled to find the right words. "It's about Cruz. About what happened between us." Jake stood there for a moment, processing her words, before sitting down beside her on the balcony. His face was calm, but his eyes were filled with something else, something Susan couldn't quite place. "Susan, I know you. You're not someone who makes decisions like that lightly. But I also know that something's been off with Cruz lately. You've both been acting strange, and I can't help but wonder if there's something more to this than just a kiss." Susan looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't want to hurt anyone, Jake. I don't want to destroy our friendship with Cruz and Victoria. But I can't pretend like nothing happened. I've never felt this way before." Jake let out a sigh, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I get it. I really do. But you need to be honest with yourself, Susan. Whatever you're feeling, whether it's a momentary lapse in judgment or something more, this isn't something you can keep hiding. You need to talk to Cruz. And you need to be honest with Victoria. The truth always comes out in the end." The weight of truth. Later that evening, Cruz stood on the balcony of his suite, his phone in his hand, but he hadn't dialed a number. He had been contemplating calling Victoria, but each time he tried, his fingers froze above the screen. What could he say to her? How could he apologize for what he had done? For the lies, the deceit, the betrayal? The door to the suite creaked open, and Cruz turned to see Jake walking in. There was a solemn look on Jake's face, a look Cruz knew all too well. His best friend had seen the storm brewing long before Cruz had admitted it to himself. "Cruz," Jake said, his voice heavy with unspoken understanding, "We need to talk." Cruz lowered his phone and nodded. He knew this conversation was inevitable. He had hoped to avoid it, but there was no more running. It was time to face the reality of his actions. Jake sat down beside him, the weight of their friendship settling between them. "I know what's been going on," Jake said quietly. "I know about you and Susan. And I need you to understand something, Cruz. You've crossed a line, and there's no easy way to fix it. But the first step is to be honest with yourself. And with Victoria." Cruz felt his heart sink at the words. He had hoped for some kind of reprieve, some way to escape the consequences of his actions, but Jake was right. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it now. "I know, Jake," Cruz said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how it happened, but I can't deny what I've done. And I don't know if I can fix it." Jake looked at him for a long moment, his expression softening. "You can't undo it, Cruz. But you can be honest. And that's the first step. It won't be easy, but it's the only way." Cruz nodded, feeling the weight of the truth settle heavily on his shoulders. He had made a mistake, a big one, but now, he had to find a way to make things right. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was the only choice he had left. Chapter 18, Confrontation and Consequences. The night felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of the world had settled over Cruz. He had spent hours pacing around his suite, trying to muster the courage to do what he knew had to be done. He couldn't avoid it anymore. Victoria deserved the truth, and so did he. The guilt, the shame, and the fear of losing everything he had worked for had driven him to the edge. He had no more excuses, no more distractions. Cruz glanced at his phone one last time, but there were still no messages from Victoria. His heart twisted with each passing minute that ticked by without any word from her. It was a painful reminder that he was losing her, perhaps already had. He needed to face her, to apologize, to do whatever he could to repair the damage. But the thought of how she would react, of the anger and hurt in her eyes, made his stomach churn. After what felt like an eternity, Cruz finally gathered himself and stood up, pacing one last time toward the door. He grabbed his keys and stepped into the hall, determined to find her and make things right. Victoria's departure. As Cruz made his way toward the suite he shared with Victoria, he noticed that the hallways were unusually quiet. The lights were dim, casting long shadows on the walls, and it seemed like the entire resort had fallen into a deep, uneasy slumber. But Cruz couldn't sleep. Not until he confronted the truth. He had avoided it long enough. When he reached the door to their suite, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. His heart raced as he waited, but the door remained closed. He knocked again, louder this time, but still there was no answer. Panic started to creep in. Where was she? After a few more minutes, he tried the door handle. To his surprise, it opened, the door creaking as he slowly pushed it open. He stepped inside, calling her name softly. "Victoria." But there was no reply. The room was empty. The bed was made, but the space beside him where Victoria should have been was cold. It was clear that she had left. His stomach dropped, and the sinking feeling of dread grew stronger. Cruz immediately went to the balcony, his eyes scanning the resort grounds below. There was no sign of her. He tried her phone one more time, but it went straight to voicemail. His mind raced. Where could she be? Why hadn't she told him anything? And then it hit him. He had driven her away. She didn't want to be near him, didn't want to face the man he had become. The weight of his mistake crushed him. A shocking revelation. After a few more hours of searching, Cruz couldn't find Victoria anywhere. He checked every corner of the resort, but she had vanished. It was like she had been swallowed whole by the world they had built together. It felt surreal, and Cruz couldn't shake the feeling that his life was slipping through his fingers. He knew he needed answers, but there was one person who might know where she had gone. He reached out to Jake. The phone rang 3 times before Jake picked up. Cruz. Jake's voice was groggy, but it quickly sharpened when he realized the urgency in Cruz's tone. Jake, have you seen Victoria? Cruz asked, his voice tinged with desperation. I've looked everywhere for her, and I can't find her. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jake's silence only added to Cruz's anxiety. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of concern. She's gone, Cruz. Cruz's heart sank. What do you mean she's gone? Where is she? I don't know where she went, but she's not here, Jake replied, the frustration clear in his voice. She left. She packed up and left this morning while you were sleeping. I think she knew you were planning to confront her. Cruz felt the floor drop out from beneath him. He could barely process the words. Victoria had left. She had known, even before he had the chance to come clean, and had chosen to leave him. A wave of nausea washed over him, and he leaned against the wall for support. Victoria's heartbreak. Victoria had known the truth for some time. It wasn't just the kiss with Susan, it was the way Cruz had been acting. The small, subtle changes in him that had gone unnoticed until everything had finally come to light. The distance in his eyes, the way he couldn't look her in the eye for more than a few seconds. She had seen the cracks forming in their relationship but had refused to acknowledge them, clinging to the hope that it was just a rough patch. But now, there was no denying it anymore. Cruz had betrayed her, and no amount of apologies could erase what he had done. She had packed her things in silence, as if the very act of leaving would somehow protect her from the pain that had been building inside her. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay at the resort any longer. Not with him, not with everything that had happened. As she walked through the lobby, her heart felt as though it had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. But there was no turning back. She had to go. She had to take care of herself, even if it meant leaving Cruz behind. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and for a moment, she considered ignoring it. But when she saw the caller ID, her heart skipped a beat. It was Cruz. She let the phone ring out, unable to bring herself to speak to him. Not now. Her hands shook as she pushed open the door of the resort and stepped into the bright sunlight. She took a deep breath, her chest heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. She had no idea what would come next, but she knew that she couldn't stay and pretend that everything was okay. A desperate search. Cruz, meanwhile, was still reeling from the revelation. He had no idea where Victoria had gone or how to reach her. His world was falling apart, and he could feel the walls closing in around him. He had messed up in ways he never imagined possible, and now, it seemed that there was no way to undo the damage. He paced through the hotel lobby, trying to think of where she might have gone. He knew she wasn't the type to run away without a plan, but her sudden disappearance caught him completely off guard. He checked with the front desk, hoping for some kind of clue, but the staff had no information to offer. Finally, Cruz decided to check the antique shop that Victoria had visited earlier that day with the girls. It was the only place he could think of where she might have gone to clear her head. He walked through the streets of the resort, his mind clouded with a sense of dread, until he reached the shop. But when he entered, he was greeted with an unsettling silence. There were no signs of Victoria, no indication that she had been there. His heart pounded as he turned to leave, but then, as if by fate, he spotted something in the corner of the store. It was a small, delicate necklace, one that Victoria had admired the day before. He picked it up, holding it in his hand, and felt a sharp pang in his chest. It was a sign, a piece of her that he had lost. Suddenly, it hit him. Victoria wasn't just gone, she was gone because of him. She had left because she couldn't bear to face the man he had become. She had trusted him, loved him, and in return, he had betrayed her. And now, there was no undoing it. With a sinking heart, Cruz realized that this was the end. The end of his marriage, the end of everything he had taken for granted. And it was all because of his own selfishness, his own desires. The truth was undeniable now: he had lost the most important person in his life. And there was no going back. Chapter 19, Unraveling Threads. The hours passed like days for Cruz. Each minute seemed to stretch into eternity as he searched the resort, hoping for a sign, a clue, anything that might lead him back to Victoria. But with each failed attempt, the hopelessness settled deeper in his chest. He had reached out to everyone he could think of: Jake, the staff, even the other guests, but no one had seen her. It was as if Victoria had simply vanished from the world he had known. Cruz sat in the empty hotel room, his fingers running through his hair, eyes locked on the floor as his mind raced. The necklace he had found in the antique store lay on the small table before him, its delicate gold chain reflecting the soft light that filtered in from the balcony. It was a reminder of what he had lost, the small but significant piece of Victoria he could no longer hold. He stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of every decision that had led him here. Every wrong turn, every choice made out of selfishness or weakness. The search continues. It was late afternoon when Cruz received a call from Jake, his voice coming through the speaker with a mix of frustration and concern. "Cruz, we need to talk," Jake said, his voice tight. "I know," Cruz replied, his words heavy. "I don't know where she is, Jake. I've looked everywhere. I can't find her." Stop," Jake interrupted, his tone more commanding than usual. "You need to come to the bar. Now. We need to figure this out." Cruz was already on edge, his nerves fraying with each passing moment. He didn't want to talk to Jake, didn't want to face anyone. But he knew Jake wasn't going to let this go. Reluctantly, Cruz agreed, grabbing his jacket and heading out the door. The weight of the day hung over him like a storm cloud, and as he walked through the resort, he couldn't help but feel the eyes of the other guests on him. The whispers had already started. It was impossible to avoid. When Cruz arrived at the bar, Jake was waiting for him at a secluded table in the back, nursing a drink and staring into the distance. Cruz sat down across from him, feeling the tension in the air before even saying a word. Jake didn't waste time. "Cruz, what the hell happened? You've been acting like a mess. Victoria's gone, and now you're just spiraling. What's going on with you?" Cruz rubbed his temples, trying to keep himself together. "I screwed up, Jake. I fucked up so badly, and now I don't know how to fix it." Jake's gaze softened, but there was a firmness in his voice when he responded. "You need to tell her the truth. All of it. Not just what happened with Susan, but everything. How you've been treating her, how you've been distancing yourself. She's not going to come back unless you show her that you're willing to be honest. That you're willing to own your mistakes." Cruz nodded, but the words felt hollow. He had already tried to apologize to Victoria, but she wasn't there to hear it. She was gone. And for the first time in their relationship, he was completely powerless to change anything. "I don't even know where she went," Cruz admitted, his voice shaky. "I've tried calling, texting, even asking the staff. She's disappeared. I've ruined everything." Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know what to tell you, man. But you've got to find her. You owe it to her and to yourself to try and make things right. Don't just sit here feeling sorry for yourself. Do something." The return of Mary and Bayor. As Cruz left the bar, feeling both defeated and determined, he passed by the pool area, where the other guests were lounging and enjoying the late afternoon sun. He briefly caught sight of Mary and Bayor, who were laughing with some other resort-goers, their carefree demeanor only amplifying Cruz's sense of guilt. The couple was the epitome of living in the moment, something that Cruz had never truly understood until now. They didn't seem weighed down by their actions, and for that, Cruz envied them. He knew that was the kind of carefree, do what feels good mentality that had led him to this point, one decision after another without considering the long-term consequences. He walked past them quickly, not wanting to be caught in a conversation that he wasn't ready to have. But Mary saw him, a knowing smile spreading across her face. She waved him over, and Cruz reluctantly approached them. "Hey there, Cruz," Mary said, her tone light and teasing. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. What's going on?" Cruz didn't know how to answer. Part of him wanted to ignore her and leave, but the other part of him, perhaps the part that was desperate for a distraction from his thoughts, decided to engage. He tried to smile, but it came out more like a grimace. "Just trying to figure things out," Cruz replied, his voice strained. "Victoria's gone. I don't know where she went or how to fix this." Mary and Bayor exchanged a look, their eyes narrowing in understanding. There was something unsettlingly familiar in their gaze, like they had seen this situation unfold many times before, but they said nothing about it. Instead, Mary reached over and placed a hand on Cruz's arm. "I'm sorry, Cruz," she said softly, her voice genuine despite the playful tone she usually carried. "But sometimes, we have to face the consequences of our actions. You can't just keep running from this. It's time to deal with the fallout." Bayor, leaning back in his chair, added his 2 cents with a grin. "Honestly, Cruz, you've got to take a hard look at what you want. You can't keep pretending like everything's fine, and you can't keep letting things slide." Cruz didn't want to hear it. He knew they were right, but hearing it from them, people who seemed to thrive in this environment of temptation and indulgence, only made him feel worse. They had no idea what it was like to be in his shoes. They had never built a life with someone they loved, only to watch it all come crashing down because of their own mistakes. But instead of arguing, Cruz simply nodded, offering them a faint smile. "Thanks," he said, though he didn't feel grateful. He wasn't sure what kind of advice he was looking for, but he didn't expect it to come from them. He didn't expect it to come from anyone. The search for Victoria. As the night fell, Cruz found himself once again in the hotel's lobby, pacing in circles. He had no idea what to do next, but something deep inside told him that he couldn't give up. He needed to find Victoria. He needed to explain himself, to show her that he was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. But where could she be? And more importantly, how could he convince her that he was truly sorry? That was the million-dollar question, and the answer remained just beyond his reach. With each passing hour, Cruz felt the reality of his situation settle in deeper. He had hurt Victoria in ways he couldn't take back, and he had no idea if she would ever forgive him. All he could do now was search for her. And hope against hope that she would give him the chance to prove that he wasn't the man he had become. Because right now, Cruz was just a man lost in the aftermath of his own choices, desperate to find a way back to the woman he had once loved. Chapter 20, The Breaking Point. Cruz's search for Victoria had reached an impasse. Hours had turned into days, and with each passing moment, the chances of finding her seemed to slip further away. His eyes, once bright with hope and determination, now looked hollow, as though the weight of his actions had drained all the color from his soul. He had tried every avenue he could think of, calling, texting, even checking with the staff at the resort, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had disappeared from the world altogether. The resort, which had once seemed like a paradise, now felt like a prison. The vibrant colors of the tropical landscape, the laughter and music in the distance, all felt muted and distant. Cruz had lost the ability to appreciate the beauty of the surroundings. Nothing mattered anymore. His life had been reduced to one painful truth: he had ruined everything. The confrontation. Late one afternoon, Cruz found himself once again in the lobby of the resort, aimlessly walking past the hotel's grand chandelier and the guests milling around, all seemingly carefree. But Cruz felt every step weigh on him as if he were trudging through thick mud. His eyes were fixed on the ground, and for the first time, he didn't even feel the need to pretend everything was okay. There was nothing left to pretend. That was when he saw her. Victoria stood near the main entrance, her back turned to him as she spoke with someone at the front desk. She looked different, colder, more distant. But to Cruz, it was like seeing a ghost. The woman he had once known so well now seemed like a stranger. His heart skipped a beat. He wanted to run to her, to throw his arms around her and beg for forgiveness. But something held him back. A fear, a hesitance, that he couldn't shake. He knew that whatever he said next could either bring them together or tear them apart forever. But there was no turning back. He had to face her, and face the consequences of his actions. "Victoria," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his with a mix of coldness and sadness. "I didn't know where you went," Cruz said, his voice strained. "I've been looking for you. Trying to find a way to make things right." Victoria's gaze remained steady, but there was no warmth in it. "I know, Cruz," she replied quietly. "I know you've been looking. But you need to understand something." Cruz took a tentative step forward, his heart in his throat. "I'm sorry. I never meant for things to get this far. I never meant to hurt you." "Stop," Victoria interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want your apologies anymore." Cruz froze, the words hitting him harder than anything he had expected. "What do you mean?" Victoria took a deep breath, her eyes flickering with pain. "You betrayed me, Cruz. In ways that go beyond just a kiss. You've been emotionally distant for so long, and you didn't even notice how far we were drifting apart. You didn't see how much I was trying to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore." Her words cut through him like a knife. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. The truth was too much to bear. Everything she said was right. He had been so caught up in his own desires, his own fears, that he had neglected the woman he had promised to love and cherish. "I thought I could fix it," Cruz said softly, his voice breaking. "But I see now that I've done too much damage. I can't undo what I've done." Victoria's gaze softened for a brief moment, but her resolve was unshaken. "No, you can't. And I'm not sure I can ever forgive you." The heart of the matter. Victoria took a step back, her arms crossing over her chest as if to protect herself from the pain that seemed to consume both of them. Cruz watched her, helpless and broken. Every word, every movement, felt like a final nail in the coffin of their marriage. "I need space, Cruz," Victoria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to figure out who I am without you. I've been holding on to this fantasy of us, but now I see it was just that, a fantasy. You've shown me the reality, and it's something I can't accept anymore." Cruz closed his eyes, the weight of her words crushing him. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was the end of the life they had built together. The dreams, the plans, the shared memories, it was all slipping away, one word at a time. "I don't know what to do without you," Cruz admitted, his voice raw. "I don't know how to fix this." Victoria's eyes were filled with sadness, but there was also a quiet strength in her expression. "You can't fix it, Cruz. Sometimes, things just break, and they can't be mended. Not everything can be fixed with apologies. Not everything can be fixed with promises." There was a long silence between them. Cruz stood frozen, unable to say anything that would make things better. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow. It was as if the air around him had thickened, suffocating him with the reality of what he had done. Finally, Victoria turned away, her back to him once again. "I need to go," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Victoria, please," Cruz begged, reaching out a hand. But she didn't turn back. Without another word, she walked away, leaving Cruz standing there, alone. The sound of her footsteps echoed in his ears, and with each step she took, the distance between them grew farther. He watched her leave, feeling the sting of her absence cut through him. He had lost her. He had lost everything. The aftermath. The next few days were a blur of emotions for Cruz. He couldn't focus on anything. The guilt gnawed at him constantly, eating away at his resolve. He tried to keep himself busy attending meetings, making phone calls, engaging in distractions, but none of it mattered. It was all meaningless without Victoria. He had tried to reach out to her again, but she didn't respond. Her phone was off, her room empty. Cruz had no idea where she had gone or what she was doing. All he knew was that she had left, and she wasn't coming back. There were moments when he wanted to give up completely. The pain of her absence was unbearable. But deep down, Cruz knew that he couldn't stop trying. He couldn't just let her go without a fight, even if that fight meant confronting the truth about himself, his mistakes, and the person he had become. He walked around the resort, unable to escape the memories that haunted him. The places where they had shared intimate moments, the smiles they had exchanged, the future they had planned, everything felt like a distant dream, fading with every step he took. But as the days stretched on, Cruz came to a realization: Victoria might never forgive him. She might never come back. And while that thought tore him apart, he knew he couldn't spend the rest of his life regretting the past. He had to learn from it, grow from it, and find a way to move forward whether or not she was in his future. Cruz sat on the balcony of his suite, staring out at the vast ocean before him. The horizon was hazy, the waves crashing against the shore in rhythmic patterns. It was beautiful, but it felt like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. He reached for his phone and typed a message to Victoria. The words came slowly, each one carefully chosen, but he couldn't find the perfect ones. All he could do was be honest. I don't know what comes next, but I know I will never stop loving you. I will always regret what I've done, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a better man. He hit send, not knowing if she would ever read it. All he could do now was wait. But in that moment, Cruz realized that waiting might be the hardest part of all. Chapter 21, A New Beginning. Cruz awoke to the sound of the ocean waves crashing softly against the shore, the rhythmic pulse of the sea a gentle reminder of the passage of time. He had hardly slept the night before, his mind swirling with thoughts of Victoria, the endless regret, and the deep longing to make things right. But as the sun crept into the sky, painting the room with soft gold and amber hues, he felt a sense of finality settle over him. No matter how much he wanted to undo the damage, he knew it couldn't be fixed overnight. He would have to learn to live with the consequences of his actions. Sitting up in bed, Cruz stared out at the balcony, watching the waves crash against the rocks in the distance. The resort, which once felt like a paradise, now seemed more like a prison, beautiful, yet suffocating. It was as though the very walls of the place carried the weight of his mistakes, trapping him in the memories of what he had lost. A day of reflection, he had decided, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, to stop running from the pain. He wasn't going to spend the day searching for Victoria, not today. Today, he would face the reality of his situation and find a way to move forward. He took a deep breath and reached for his phone, checking for any messages, though he knew deep down that nothing would have changed. As expected, there was no new message from Victoria. But there was one from Jake, the only person who had stood by him through everything. Cruz, I know things are hard right now, but don't give up on yourself. You've been through worse, and you'll get through this too. Let's talk when you get a chance. Cruz put the phone down, unsure whether to respond. He wasn't sure if he had the strength to face anyone at this moment. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Jake was right. If he gave up now, if he stayed buried in the pain, it would be over. He had to take control of his life again. The resort pool. Deciding that some fresh air might do him good, Cruz headed down to the resort's pool area. The sun was high in the sky now, the heat bearing down on everything, but the cool breeze from the ocean made it bearable. Guests were lounging by the pool, some sipping drinks, others deep in conversation, while the staff moved about with practiced ease, ensuring that everyone had everything they needed. Cruz found an empty lounge chair and settled into it, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push aside the gnawing ache in his chest, but it was impossible. The emptiness that Victoria's absence left behind was all-consuming. It was a void he didn't know how to fill. As he lay there, lost in his thoughts, he felt the presence of someone approaching. He opened his eyes and saw Jake standing at the edge of the pool, a glass of something in his hand. Jake's ever-present smile was gone, replaced by a more serious expression. "Mind if I join you?" Jake asked, already sitting down in the chair next to Cruz before he could answer. "Sure," Cruz replied quietly, sitting up and turning toward him. Jake took a sip of his drink before speaking, his voice low. "I know things aren't great right now, Cruz. But I want you to understand something. You're not alone in this. Yeah, what you did was messed up. No doubt about it. But we all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next." Cruz didn't respond at first, letting Jake's words sink in. He wanted to say something, to explain just how bad he felt about everything. But he didn't have the words. It was like the weight of his guilt was too heavy to put into speech. "I don't know how to fix this," Cruz finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix what's broken between Victoria and me." Jake leaned back in his chair, the warm breeze ruffling his hair. "You can't force someone to forgive you, Cruz. I've been there. Sometimes, the damage is just too much, and you've got to give the other person space to heal. But that doesn't mean you can't still work on yourself. You can still grow, still learn from all of this." Cruz nodded slowly, but the bitterness in his heart refused to disappear. "I don't know if I can ever make it right with her. I don't know if she'll ever come back." Jake met his gaze, his eyes steady and sure. "I'm not going to lie to you, man. Maybe she won't. But that doesn't mean you just give up on your life. You have to keep going. For you. Even if she doesn't come back, there's still a future out there for you." For the first time in days, Cruz felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't a guarantee, and it didn't change the pain of the present, but it was something to hold on to. He had been so focused on finding a way back to Victoria that he had lost sight of himself. Perhaps it was time to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. An unexpected encounter as Cruz and Jake sat there, talking quietly about the future and what lay ahead. A familiar voice interrupted their conversation. "Cruz." He turned his head to see Mary standing by the poolside, a playful glint in her eye. Her appearance was as radiant as ever, though there was something different in the way she looked at him, a subtle understanding that spoke volumes. She was holding a cocktail in her hand, and her smile was warm, though tinged with curiosity. "Mary," Cruz greeted her, a little surprised by the sudden appearance. "How are you?" "I'm good," she said, sitting down at the edge of the pool, her feet dipping into the cool water. "You're looking a bit lost, if you don't mind me saying." Cruz chuckled, though it lacked the usual humor. "I guess you could say I am. I've been trying to figure out what to do next." Mary took a sip of her drink before responding. "I'm not an expert, but maybe it's time you stop thinking about fixing everything and start thinking about what you need. What you want. Because right now, it seems like you're living in a state of constant regret, and that's not healthy for anyone." Jake, who had been listening quietly, nodded in agreement. "She's right. You've got to take care of yourself, Cruz. Victoria's got her own journey to go on. You can't carry all this guilt and hope on your shoulders forever. You've got to learn how to move forward without her, if that's what it comes to." Cruz glanced at both of them, taking in their words. There was truth to what they were saying. For the first time in weeks, he considered the idea that his future wasn't entirely tied to Victoria. Maybe it wasn't about fixing things, but about letting go and accepting that the past was behind him. Maybe it was time to rebuild not just his relationship, but himself. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Cruz admitted. "I don't know how to move on from this. Mary's eyes softened. No one ever does, Cruz. But you take it one day at a time. You start small. And you let go of what's holding you back. A step forward as the evening drew closer and the resort's lights began to twinkle like stars against the fading light of the day. Cruz felt a small sense of peace. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, or whether he and Victoria would ever find their way back to each other. But he did know one thing: he couldn't keep holding on to the past. For the first time in a long while, Cruz felt the weight on his chest lighten. It wasn't a sudden change, but it was a start. He didn't have all the answers, and the road ahead would be difficult. But he was ready to walk it. Thanks, you too, Cruz said, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. I think I'm starting to see things a little differently. Jake grinned. That's the spirit. Mary raised her glass in a playful toast. To new beginnings, then. Whatever that looks like. And for the first time in weeks, Cruz felt a glimmer of hope, small, fragile, but real. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he was ready to find out. Chapter 22, The Moment of Truth. The days that followed Cruz's quiet realization were a mix of introspection and tentative steps toward healing. The weight of guilt was still there, an ever-present shadow that loomed over him, but now there was an underlying shift, a sense that perhaps things could change. The resort, which once felt suffocating, had become a place for personal reckoning. With the constant reminder of what he had lost, it was hard to escape the emotional turmoil that had been consuming him, but Cruz knew that the only way forward was through conversations with himself. Cruz spent much of his time reflecting on the choices he had made, particularly his infidelity. He had always considered himself a man of integrity, a person who valued loyalty above all else. But the actions of the past few weeks had exposed his weaknesses in a way he had never imagined. He had been reckless with his marriage, using it as a mask for his own insecurities and desires. But now, standing at the crossroads of his life, Cruz had come to realize that change could only come if he was willing to look in the mirror and face the man he had become. He had been honest with himself before, but this was different. It was deeper. It was an acknowledgement of his own humanity, flawed, broken, yet still capable of redemption. Each morning, he would wake up early, sit at the edge of the bed, and quietly assess his thoughts. The first thing that came to mind was Victoria. He thought about the pain he had caused her and wondered if she would ever be able to forgive him. But he also thought about himself, the person he had neglected for far too long. As much as he wanted to fix his relationship with Victoria, Cruz knew that fixing himself was the first step. A chance encounter. One afternoon, Cruz found himself at the resort's coffee shop, his mind still preoccupied with the questions that had been haunting him. He was sitting at a small table by the window, sipping a cappuccino, when he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He looked up, surprised to see Susan walking toward him. Her smile was warm, but there was something guarded in her eyes, something that suggested she had noticed the change in him over the past few days. Susan had always been perceptive, able to read between the lines with a sharpness that few others possessed. "Cruz," she said, taking a seat across from him. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," Cruz replied, his tone more subdued than usual. He didn't know what he expected from this conversation, but he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The air between them felt charged, as if both of them were holding on to unspoken truths. After a few moments of silence, Susan spoke again. "I've been watching you, Cruz," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know you're going through a lot right now. And I know it's been hard, but I just want you to know something. I'm here for you. You're not alone in this." Cruz swallowed hard, his emotions rising to the surface. "I don't know if I deserve that. After everything I've done." Susan raised a hand to stop him. "Don't. You're going to beat yourself up for the rest of your life if you keep thinking like that. You can't change the past, Cruz. You can only move forward from here." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had been so focused on the past, so consumed with guilt, that he had forgotten about the possibility of moving forward. Maybe it was time to stop punishing himself and start working toward the person he could still become. Victoria's return later that evening, as Cruz was sitting by the poolside, nursing a glass of scotch, he saw a figure approaching in the distance. At first, he wasn't sure who it was, but as the person drew closer, his heart skipped a beat. It was Victoria. She looked as beautiful as ever, her hair flowing in soft waves, her expression a mixture of determination and weariness. She wasn't smiling, but there was a quiet strength about her. Cruz's pulse quickened, and his breath caught in his throat. He had been waiting for this moment, and yet now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to say. Victoria stopped a few feet away from him, her gaze steady. Cruz. He stood up quickly, his glass of scotch forgotten on the table. His voice was thick with emotion. Victoria. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. She offered a small nod, her eyes never leaving his. I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us. And I realized something. I can't keep running from this. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not. Cruz's chest tightened. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right. Victoria's lips parted, as if she were about to speak, but then she took a deep breath. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. I don't know if I'm even capable of that anymore. The words hit Cruz like a punch to the gut, but he stood there, silently, taking the pain without flinching. But I'm willing to try. I'm willing to see if we can rebuild what we had. If you're willing to do the work. Not just for me, for us, but for you, too. Cruz felt a flicker of hope rise within him, but he knew this was just the beginning of the road to redemption. This wasn't an instant fix. It would take time. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. He had to prove to Victoria, and to himself, that he could change. I'm ready to do the work, Cruz said, his voice raw. I've been lost for too long. But I want to find my way back. I want to find us again. Victoria's eyes softened slightly, but there was still a trace of sadness in them. It won't be easy, Cruz. We've both hurt each other. But I'm willing to try. A new path that evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Cruz and Victoria sat together by the pool. The weight of their conversation hung in the air, but there was a new sense of possibility between them. Cruz knew the journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was no longer afraid of facing them. They sat in silence for a while, the soft hum of the resort's nightlife filling the space between them. Cruz glanced at Victoria, his heart heavy with emotion. She was still the woman he loved, but he knew now that love wasn't enough. They had to rebuild their foundation from the ground up. I don't know what the future holds for us, Victoria said softly, breaking the silence. But I do know this: I want to find a way back to each other. But we both have to want it. We both have to put in the effort. Cruz nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I'll do whatever it takes. And with that simple promise, Cruz realized that the journey of redemption, of healing, had truly begun. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be fast. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. As the night deepened and the stars began to twinkle above, Cruz and Victoria sat together, taking the first steps on a new path, one where forgiveness and healing were not just ideals, but a reality they would work toward, hand in hand. The end.